before the House Banking Committee about the monetary situation in Asia. Later, Deputy Secretary of the Treasury Lawrence Summers and several economists spoke about the impact of Asia markets on America's economy. Iowa Congressman Jim Leach calls the 5-hour hearing to session.
Committee come to order. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to welcome our distinguished witnesses, and particularly like to thank Chairman Greenspan, who yesterday chaired a meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee and has agreed to appear today without setting a precedent to help us interpret the implications of the recent financial instability in Asia. We're also pleased to see again Deputy Secretary Summers and look forward to his testimony. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the causes of the recent currency and financial market turbulence in East Asia, its implications for the region and broader world economy, as well as the policy response by the United States, other governments, and international financial institutions. As we've all come to understand, the powerful waves of financial instability that had their origin this summer in Thailand have reverberated across the currency and equity markets of East Asia. Not even Hong Kong, with its extraordinary macroeconomic management and substantial foreign reserves, or South Korea, with its $500 billion GDP and OECD status, have emerged unscathed. And of course, the U.S. and European equity markets, as well as those in Latin America, have also been at least indirectly buffeted by Asia's economic turbulence. From a congressional perspective, it would appear that in this new era of global finance, destabilizing events in one part of the world are not easily isolated. Instability is like a virus. Nation states which conduct imprudent macroeconomic policies and which countenance imprudent banking regulation and supervision can propitiate contagions that may impair or threaten the stability of the international financial system. The quicker and stronger the medicine applied, the greater the likelihood any damage can be controlled. In this context, Indonesia's recent announcement of a comprehensive package of macroeconomic policies and structural reforms supported by financing from the IMF and backstopped by supplemental contingent financing by the U.S. and other countries would appear to be appropriate. Should this IMF-led package help restore financial stability in Indonesia as hoped and expected, that would send a powerful signal to other countries in the region which have yet to demonstrate the political commitment and economic policies needed to restore market confidence. On the other hand, Congress needs to be assured that the taxpayer resources are not exposed to imprudent risk, that U.S. participation in this financial assistance package is accompanied by strong macroeconomic conditionality, as well as an emphasis on banking system reform, improving governance, and reducing public corruption. For a decade, this committee has quietly urged the IMF and World Bank to give priority attention to the importance of developing sound banking systems as a prerequisite for orderly economic growth. A country that lacks a solid banking infrastructure where private savings can be protected and prudently recycled in lending and investment vehicles is incapable of achieving economic security. In too many places, corruption has replaced communism as the greatest threat to world order. In many countries, banks are particularly vulnerable to inside thievery for the same reason Willie Sutton stuck them up from the outside. That's where the money is. Hence, it is key that banks are properly incentivized, subject to responsible regulation, and open to international competition. In the Indonesian model, it is impressive that the IMF and World Bank, in conjunction with the Asian Development Bank, are giving comprehensive attention to reforming the banking system. It may be good politics, as in Malaysia, to use foreign investors as scapegoats, but it's better economics to welcome foreign competition, particularly in finance. There is no protectionism more counterproductive for an emerging society than that which relates to banking. As members are aware, there appears to be substantial disagreement in the economic community on the impact of the October sell-off in world equity markets and potential for additional financial shocks in developing markets of the U.S. economy. Chairman Greenspan and Deputy Secretary Summers have suggested separately that the fallout from Asia on the U.S. economy is likely to be modest but discernible. On the other hand, a rising chorus of private sector analysts suggests that the latest Asian turmoil is unambiguously disinflationary for industrial countries and possibly even deflationary, and that the crisis this week is greater than the Mexican crisis 2 years ago. Indeed, evidence suggests that the economies of East Asia are suffering from substantial asset deflation and competitive devaluations that appear likely to impart a contractionary impulse to the rest of the world economy. Meanwhile, the world's second largest economy in Japan remains moribund. How will developing countries react to recent events in East Asia? The most counterproductive course of action would be for them to conclude that open trade and open financial markets are more of a threat than an opportunity. In this context, one can only ask how prudential it is for the U.S. to refuse to endorse fast track and appear to turn our back on expanding the international trading system, particularly given that our economy is in the best shape in a generation and the benefits of free trade are not only philosophically manifest, but in implementation have so evidently manifested themselves. Certainly the economic history of this century should teach Congress that the combination of competitive devaluation and hostility to trade jeopardizes U.S. economic security. Finally, let me briefly comment on two interrelated international issues which the Congress has yet to address, but may today. The first relates to the UN, the second the International Monetary Fund. The United States, a country more than any other which precipitated the creation of the League of Nations in the aftermath of World War I and subsequently the United Nations in the aftermath of World War II, is now in substantial arrears in our obligations to the UN, an institution made necessary in part because we failed to support the League of Nations in its collective security precepts in the interwar years. Today, we are confronted with the possibility of renewed confrontation in the Persian Gulf. The United Nations is with us, but incredibly, we do not seem to be willing to support the United Nations. The alternative is for the U.S. to go it alone, a prospect few Americans prefer. Similarly, in international economic affairs, the IMF and World Bank were created after World War II to establish a regime of shared responsibilities for the international economic system. Today, a crisis in confidence in the economic order has emerged, precipitated by events in Asia. If this Congress does not approve an enhancement of the ability of the IMF to act by at least approving the new arrangement to borrow, which legislatively stems from this committee, the international economic order could be subject to greater instability with the U.S. forced to rely on unilateral economic tools. Most Americans are apprehensive of anything hinting of foreign aid. Nonetheless, they prefer burden sharing to putting U.S. taxpayers solely on the line, and they prefer lending arrangements which include practical free market and fiscal discipline quid pro quos to direct foreign aid. Now is the time for the political games to stop in the Congress and the executive and legislative branches to stand tall together for responsible internationalism. U.S. national purpose cannot afford to be diverted by continued political posturing. The U.S. cannot face the world rudderless. It's time for leadership. Mr. LaFalce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Drs. Greenspan and Summers. I'm pleased, Mr. Chairman, that you called this hearing to examine the events related to Asia's currency crisis, a crisis that has rippled through economies and stock markets worldwide. If we have learned anything from the events since last July, it is that globalization of international finance is a reality. We cannot wall off our economies, our stock markets, or our currencies. We therefore must develop our economic and financial policies with the clear understanding that they will have an impact on the international financial system. I will not go into any detail on the financial gyrations of the last months or on the October crash heard around the world, but I do want to make three general points. First, as with Mexico's peso crisis that began in December of '94, we should not think that Asia's currency crisis occurred without warning. Certain economic conditions warned of pending trouble. Much of the dynamic 8 to 12% annual growth of the Southeast Asian countries was spurred by speculation in real estate and stocks rather than rising productivity or innovative creativity. Combined with weak and unregulated banking and financial systems, the bubble was waiting to burst. In addition, most of the Southeast Asian countries kept their currencies artificially pegged to the dollar, perhaps for too long. This policy helped their exports sell cheaply on world markets when the dollar was weak. As the dollar strengthened, Southeast Asian exports became less competitive. Competition from Chinese exports also undermined their export performance, and trade balances worsened. My point is that there are usually warning signs to a coming financial crisis. We must learn to recognize and then heed those warning signs. Secondly, I continue to believe that we must give more attention to the role of currency speculators in destabilizing financial markets. In this world of global electronic exchange, between $1 to $2 trillion in currency exchange occurs daily. Some have blamed currency traders, especially those outside Asia, for most of today's currency crisis, and called for tighter regulation or even a total ban on foreign exchange trading. I can understand the frustration with currency speculation. The funding available to central banks and monetary authorities that may try to defend their currencies is no match for the volume of currency trading in open market economies. I am uncertain whether we should rely totally on the whim or fate of the markets. We must examine much more closely the interrelationships between currency trading, speculation, and financial stability. And third, I continue to hope and believe that Treasury's semi-annual report to Congress on international economic and exchange rate policy could be an important tool, a warning device for anticipating crises in the financial markets. I've been disappointed in past reports, either because they have not been timely or because their treatment of exchange rate issues has been cursory, some would say superficial. I understand the next report will be issued tomorrow, but in reading the last report of February 1997, there were no warnings of problems that might arise 3 months later. Perhaps these reports can do better in the future. Mr. Chairman, I wasn't going to mention this, but you mentioned fast track, and so I just want to say a brief word about that. Some people confuse the issue of fast track with being either pro-global trade or protectionist. That is an absolutely, totally false dichotomy. One can still support global trade enthusiastically and either have reservations or opposition to fast track. I just want to say this about fast track. We give the president no authority, although that's how the debate is usually framed. The president has plenary authority to negotiate whatever he wants at any time with whichever country he wants. We are asked to give up congressional authority. That's what fast track's all about. Congress is asked to give up its authority to amend a bill implementing an agreement. There are some things that are difficult with that, though, even fraudulent. First of all, we can pass laws purporting to give up our authority, but those laws would be constitutionally unenforceable. We cannot give up a law forfeiting our right to offer amendments to bills. It's in the Constitution. We can't bind ourselves, much less future Congresses. So to that extent, it's fraudulent. Secondly, no one seems to know that the bills that have been submitted and passed in previous Congresses and the bill considered last week have provisions within it that say Congress shall offer no amendments unless Congress wishes to offer amendments. That's in the fine print. Congress shall offer no amendment to an implementing bill unless either house passes a rule permitting amendments. We pass rules on every single bill. The bill itself is fraudulent. So some people just view fast track as converting for purposes of trade, at least I do, from the constitutional system we have to a parliamentary system where for purposes of trade we treat the president as prime minister and the Congress as the parliament, and as parliaments simply vote yes or no, the Congress would simply vote yes or no. And so there's a convergence of interests between foreign governments and the president on that issue. We can favor global trade, tremendously expanded, and still have qualms about giving up a constitutional prerogative, something we cannot do by legislation. I thank the chair.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I didn't know I'd precipitated such a debate, but I mean, his comments from his perspective obviously are warranted. But Mr. McCollum.
I have very brief limited remarks. I do want to welcome our witnesses today, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to hear from them what they feel are the primary causes of the disturbances we've seen in the economies in Southeast Asia. I know there's been a lot written on the subject lately, but we're all very greatly interested in what both of the primary witnesses with us today have to say, as well as our second panel. And I'm also curious to know their responses to various criticisms that have been leveled over the past few weeks with regard both to International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and United States policies that may have affected or aggravated the policies in Southeast Asia. Some have argued that the devaluations that have occurred should not have occurred, that the International Monetary Fund was primarily responsible for those devaluations. There have been others who simply have said that the results were inevitable and there was nothing anybody could do about them. But there are a lot of questions that are out there, not only about where we go from here in Southeast Asia and what caused them, but what, if anything, we did or didn't do that aggravated those conditions. So I'm very much keenly interested today, and thank you for having this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. McCollum. Mr. Benno.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm anxious to hear from our witnesses. I think it's important to articulate and try to analyze the phenomena that is going on today in terms of the global marketplace, especially as the genesis of it appears to be in the Pacific Rim, an important global trading partner and market for many nations. And our role as and trying to provide economic leadership and stability in the global marketplace is, I think, well understood, or should be well understood. I think that in looking at the bend points and trying to analyze this, I'm not interested in necessarily assigning blame until we properly dissect and examine this and find out what the important elements are that we can change, whether this is market-driven, whether it's driven by the conduct of the financial intermediaries and or the economy. Would appropriate for us to try and analyze that and try to fill in the gaps that are occurring and try to rectify the problem with the least amount of disruption that we can experience. Clearly, it's apparent, Mr. Chairman, that, and I think to all, that we are not insulated and that these events take place with the rapidity and electricity that has immediate and profound effects upon our domestic economy. And so I'm very pleased that the Chairman of the Board of Governors and others in the administration have come to engage us, involve us in this problem as we search for solutions, and look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and with others to try and rectify and address the challenge that we face today in the global economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Benno. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Bacchus.
Thank you. Mr. Greenspan, Chairman Greenspan and Secretary Summers, we welcome you to our hearing today. I've bottom line just got one question, and that's what the risk of the Asian economic crisis, what they are to the United States, what they are to the world economy, and therefore to the United States. So that will be my entire line of questioning. And also, what factors here might make that crisis a greater threat to our economy, like the high stock market. I did hear a comment that we'd had a stock market crash in October. I missed that. I didn't realize that was a crash. But, you know, maybe we want to know whether we could have a real crash. Secondly, you testified 2 weeks ago before Congress. At that time, this economic crisis was somewhat confined to being a Thai crisis. There was some question about whether it would be contained. Since then, it has spread to Japan, South Korea, Latin America. So I would ask you to maybe, if you have any reassessment over the last 2 weeks from the events that have occurred since that time, and maybe revise your remarks, or not revise them, but because they wouldn't be a revision, just update them. And one reason that I would ask why this is a risk to the United States and what the extent of that risk is because this Congress is asked to fund IMF, and to tell the American people that this is a proper expenditure, we really need to be able to justify this expense. And therefore, if it's not a risk, it's hard to justify us intervening. So that will be the focus of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bacchus. Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to focus on fast track because I think this is directly relevant. What we have here in the Indonesia loan is a very clear-cut example of why many of us who support in concept the notion of increased acceptance of the global economy so strongly oppose fast track. What we have here is a program put forward by the IMF, strongly supported by the U.S. government, which in fact then added its own standby supplemental program, which focuses exclusively on improving the mobility of capital. Now, I believe the mobility of capital is a good thing. As technology has made capital physically more mobile, we have been asked to support legislative and other changes that make it more mobile legally, and I do believe that adds ultimately to the overall production in the world. But the mobility of capital at any given moment, any given society, is often used to the disadvantage of working people. The threat, we're going to move, we can do this elsewhere, is one that strikes fear into the hearts of all those who are concerned about compensation of workers. We've had a situation in this country where working people have clearly not participated in a proportionate way in the increase in the overall economy that we've seen. We have seen great growth with stagnation in wages. Indeed, we have been told by many economists that the only reason we have been able to continue economic growth is that we have had stagnation in wages. And the threat that wages would begin to increase has been held out as one factor that would lead to a reduction in growth. What many of us have argued is that given that the mobility of capital has two effects. One, it promotes the overall efficiency of production, but two, it increases the leverage of owners over workers in a way that retards equity. We believe that policies that promote globalization and the mobility of capital ought to be accompanied by concern about equity. Now, we are told by people in power in the administration that they agree with that. But I must be honest and say that the Indonesia example shows what I fear is the case. Yes, they may agree. They think it is a hobby. They think it is nice, indeed admirable, for liberals to be worried about the environment and human rights and worker rights. But when adults sit down to serious business, they disappear. They get brushed off the table. When adults get down to running the world, all that counts is to enhance the mobility of capital. And concerns about the rights of workers, the rights of indigenous peoples such as the East Timorese, the size of military budgets, which my colleague from Massachusetts has focused on, those things aren't, they're distractions. We have in Indonesia a country which is guilty of the most outrageous abuse of the people of East Timor, in defiance, by the way, of the United Nations. Those who believe international law is important obviously know that the Indonesian oppression of the people of East Timor is an absolute flagrant abuse of United Nations rule. We have a corrupt dictator in charge of the country. We have, his notion of family values is to make sure every member of his family gets cut in on a juicy monopoly. We have no serious rights for labor. We have no genuine democracy. The head of the opposition party was kicked out. Now we have this country in need, so they come to the IMF. And by the way, we have a package of bills that have passed out of this committee, most of them, or some at the Appropriations Committee, which say when we, the United States, go to the international financial institutions, we should use the voice and vote of our executive director to promote human rights, to promote the rights of indigenous people, to reduce excessive military spending, to promote the rights of labor, and to protect the environment. We voted, I assume, for an IMF package that does none of those things. Now, I read the package. I am enjoined by confidentiality from quoting the package. But that's not a problem, because you don't have to quote what ain't there. And what I am talking about is zero evidence that any of these issues, human rights, the rights of indigenous people, environment, worker rights, or the reduction in military expenditures, at all figured in. In fact, not only did we vote for that program, but we have thrown another $3 billion standby into the pot. Now, I do not contest the fact that it was in our interest to try and help restabilize East Asia. My problem is that this is done with zero regard for these other issues. You just brush them off, and that's why many of us voted against fast track. International trade, which expands the mobility of capital, but pays attention to the inequities that will be the result of that, would be an attractive policy. But here's a test case of it. And right in the middle of the debate over fast track, when people are trying to show us that they take seriously these concerns, we get a package for Indonesia which totally ignores them. And I read Secretary Rubin's October 31st statement, and he lists 4 things about the IMF program: tight monetary policy, tight fiscal policy, closing insolvent banks and improving bank regulation, and then improve economic efficiency by ending monopolies, reducing tariffs and non-tariffs, and bringing off-budget accounts under tight supervision. That's his summary of the package, an accurate one, it seems to me, and not a single one of our concerns is there. So I appreciate the indulgence on the time, Mr. Chairman, but I just want to say you get, and by the way, I read Mr. Kamdasu's speech, and I've read the IMF's own package. There is one reference to maintaining the social safety net, but that is a statement of fact, and what it says is, we won't reduce what we're now spending on poor people. But that isn't even a condition. There's no conditionality about that. That's a statement of intent. Conditionality comes in improving the mobility of capital. So I just want to end by saying, to those who are concerned about this, I share your view that it's in our interest to help stabilize East Asia and Southeast Asia. I think increased globalization will add to our overall product, but it inevitably will have, both here and elsewhere, effects promoting inequity in the near term. And until you are prepared to integrate concern about equity and the environment into that overall approach, you're going to continue to have this situation. And I've said it before and we'll say it again. People have forgotten what John Kennedy said when he launched the Alliance for Progress and referred back to Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy. Franklin Roosevelt, he said, could be a good neighbor abroad because he was a good neighbor at home. Until and unless there is more willingness on the part of the administration and others, and including the business community, that think this is a one-way street where they get help anytime they need it from government action, including government money, but then resist any effort to promote equity. Until there's a recognition that those two have to go hand in hand, you're going to continue to have the kind of frustration that you encountered at Fast Track. Thank you for the indulgence on the time, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Kennedy, and I've been handed a request from one of our members about...
Is it my hair, Mr. Chairman?
The time we are taking, and the chair apologizes because he took in inordinate time to begin with, but if we can hold some requests to lower levels of time, that would be helpful. I know Dr. Paul requested to speak. Does anyone that precedes him? Then Dr. Paul is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. I appreciate you bringing these hearings about, and welcome Chairman Greenspan and Secretary Summers. I do have a couple-page statement. I will not read both pages.
Without objection, it will be placed in the record.
I would like to read the introduction.
Of course.
The Asian financial markets are unsteady, and for good reasons. Many have correctly anticipated the ongoing financial events as a natural consequence of a sustained worldwide credit expansion of unprecedented proportions. According to free market sound money economics, all credit expansions set the stage for the correction. These corrections are undesired by the dreamers of perpetual prosperity generated by loose central bank monetary policy. The source of the problem the world financial markets currently face is unwise monetary policy, plain and simple. Although the business cycle has been fully understood by the Austrian free market economists throughout most of this century, they have been ignored by our government-run universities, the major media, and the politicians. And since the now collapsing financial bubble was the largest ever, due to an unprecedented globalization of credit expansion, the implications for the world economy should gain the attention of everyone concerned about public policy. The world has been functioning with total fiat currencies for more than a quarter century, a first. Even with continuous adjustments in the international exchange markets, artificial relationships develop between currencies. These imbalances are subject to market forces demanding new exchange rates. And as we are witnessing, they occur with shocks to the entire financial system. More huge IMF, U.S. Treasury, ESF bailouts and Federal Reserve bailouts are currently planned, cannot solve the problem. They will only make our problems worse. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Does anyone else on the, Mr. Kennedy?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome both my good friend Larry Summers and Chairman Greenspan as well. I think that last evening the House of Representatives stripped out from the Foreign Operations Bill the funding for the IMF. I think it is always a terrible mistake that this country makes to try to pursue our domestic agenda by virtue of the fact that we end up beating up on both the World Bank, the UN, and the IMF, whose basic functions provide some stability throughout the world. But I also think that it's a terrible mistake as well to ignore what is at the root cause of a lot of the disruptions that have ended up taking place throughout many of the world's economies. You read a few weeks ago when the stock market dropped over 500 points, most of the analysis done indicated that this was as a result of instability in the Asian markets. In today's paper, as a result of 157 point drop in yesterday's market, they're saying it's because of instability in the Asian markets. Now, if you look at what that means, it seems to me that what people are really saying is that whether you talk about Indonesia or Thailand, and many others think that Korea is on its way in a much bigger way than either one of these two countries, that there is a serious problem with regard to how these regimes have propped themselves up. If you look at how they do prop themselves up, the fact of the matter is they do it in many ways at the detriment of their own people. And I think that it is an incredible mistake for the United States, which is the leader of the free world, not just in terms of our economy, but in terms of the moral authority of this nation, to not stand and talk about what is really going on in these countries. What is going on when Indonesia itself in 1994 spent 16.3% of its budget, $4.8 billion. $4.8 billion on military expenditures. And we're not going to bring that up in terms of what is going on with with how these countries spend their money. We're going to say, well, listen, the United States is going to spend $8 billion bailing out the Indonesian government, but we're not going to bring up how they spend their funds? It seems to me that you look at as Mr. Frank indicated, East Timor, some of the worst human rights abuses that take place on the face of the earth have taken place by the Indonesian government. If we allow these kinds of corrupt regimes to continue to be propped up when they come to on their knees looking for the bailout from the international community, if we don't bring up at that time how they spend their money on their military, how they abuse their people, we are going to come back here, and you will be back here within 2, 3, 4, 5 years, looking for more money to bail out these same countries because they're not dealing with the fundamental wrong of how their economies are built. If you build your economy solely on a immoral purpose of squeezing out the lowest possible wages and providing the highest possible profits to the fewest amount of people, if you at the same time build up a military which then wreaks havoc upon your own people, if you squeeze out all the natural resources in your own country without any benefit going to the ordinary folks, and build up an economy where people can buy and sell and grow and prosper themselves, I think in the end, we end up being asked to bail out countries that are fundamentally corrupt in nature. So I just hope, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Summers, who I know cares about these issues, that we recognize the importance. I'm willing to provide the funding necessary to all of these international organizations, but I do it with the hope that we use our strong voice to stand up for the moral authority that has made this country not only the strong economy, but has made this country the envy of the rest of the world in terms of what we stand for as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Kennedy, for that thoughtful statement. Mr. Sanders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm also delighted to welcome Mr. Greenspan and Mr. Summers here today to talk about the economic crisis in Asia and the Indonesian bailout, which includes a $10 billion loan from the IMF, a $3.5 billion loan from the World Bank, and a $3 billion contingency loan underwritten by the taxpayers of the United States. Mr. Chairman, I have one slight problem with this bailout. It's illegal. And I intend to do all that I can to stop it. Now, let me read directly from the law, commonly known as the Sanders-Frank Amendment, or maybe Mr. Frank thinks it's the Frank-Sanders Amendment. Nonetheless, it is the law. And it was enacted by Congress in the spring of 1994, coming out of this committee. Mr. Summers, this is the law. 1. The Secretary of the Treasury shall direct the United States executive directors of the international financial institutions to use the voice and vote of the United States to urge the respective institution, 1, please listen closely, to adopt policies to encourage borrowing countries, i.e. like Indonesia, to guarantee internationally recognized worker rights, and to include the status of such rights as an integral part of the institution's policy dialogue with each borrowing country. 2, in developing the policies referred to in paragraph 1, to use the relevant conventions of the international labor organizations which have set forth, among other things, the right of association, the right to organize and bargain collectively, a prohibition on the use of forced or compulsory labor, and certain minimum labor standards that take into account, et cetera, et cetera. In plain English, now we're off the law, now we're back to English. In plain English, what this means is that the United States government cannot support any IMF or World Bank loans to Indonesia unless the loan proposal guarantees internationally recognized worker rights. Mr. Chairman, I have before me the proposal of the Indonesian military dictatorship led by General Suharto, which details the policies they are proposing in order to obtain these loans. I have read this proposal carefully, and I have not found one word in it, not one word in it, which suggests that they will adopt policies guaranteeing internationally recognized worker rights. Further, as the law very clearly requires, they do not include the status of such rights as an integral part of the institution's policy dialogue. Therefore, plain and simple, it is against the law for the United States and the Secretary of Treasury to support this bailout, and I hope that they will desist immediately from doing so. Mr. Chairman, almost nobody except total apologists for the Indonesian government disputes that Indonesia is an authoritarian society and that workers there do not enjoy internationally recognized workers' rights. Now, I can quote you forever, but let me be very brief. Let me quote from the United States State Department's annual Human Rights Report for 1996, and I would hope that the Department of Treasury occasionally talks to the Department of State. And this is what the State Department says, quote, despite a surface adherence to democratic forms, the Indonesian political system remains strongly authoritarian. The government is dominated by an elite comprising President Suharto, his close associates, and the military. And on it goes. The State Department tells us that there are it is not a democratic society, and that workers' rights do not exist. I won't read it all. I will submit that to the record. Further, let me quote from the Dickinson School of Law in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which on June 2nd, 1997, awarded a special rule of law citation in absentia to Mukhtar Pakpahan, an Indonesian lawyer who has risked his life and sacrificed his freedom for democratic ideals. And what they say in the Dickinson School of Law is that you have a courageous man fighting for the rights of workers in that country who is now rotting in jail in a totally propped up charge. And now let me quote from a statement of the AFL-CIO, Executive Council, February 19th, in awarding Mukhtar Pakpahan the George Meany Human Rights Award. Quote, the heavy-handed campaign against Brother Pakpahan and his union, culminating in the show trial now being held in Jakarta, has made a mockery of the rule of law in Indonesia and any pretense that the Indonesian government has any respect for internationally recognized worker rights. And the AFL-CIO Executive Committee, quite rightly, suggests that the United States government vote against all projects submitted by Indonesia to multilateral development and investment institutions. Now, let me conclude my remarks, Mr. Chairman, by saying the following. Even if this bailout was legal, and it is not legal, I would oppose it. Not only is it morally wrong for the United States to provide political and economic support for an illegitimate authoritarian government such as the Suharto regime, but it is totally absurd. It is an outrage that the taxpayers of this country are forced to bail out a family which Forbes magazine claims is one of the richest families in the world. They estimate that General Suharto alone is worth $16 billion. His family is worth $30 billion. And you take 50 more of their allies, they're worth $60 billion. And I would like Mr. Summers to tell the taxpayers of the state of Vermont, whose real incomes are in decline, why they should have to bail out a group of people worth $60 billion. If they need the money so much, let them pay for their own bailout and not ask the taxpayers and the working people of this country. So I would hope, and I'm going to persist on this issue, you're disobeying the law, and what you're doing is wrong, and I hope you don't go forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I would like to start with the witnesses, but if someone has something else that's very important, Mrs. Maloney.
I likewise would like to welcome Chairman Greenspan and Larry Summers. Since the 1990 and 91 recession, this country has experienced sustained economic growth under the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve and the economic policies of the Clinton administration. I have confidence in your ability to provide leadership to the United States in cooperation with the International Monetary Fund and other countries to minimize financial market instability in Asian markets. We have seen the domino effect in Asia and other financial markets around the world. When Indonesia allowed the international value of its currency to float on July 2nd of this year, the value of its currency fell by 20% in July. Financial markets around the world quickly responded to the declines in Asian markets. It is very important to keep financial markets working as smoothly as possible. Prolonged chaotic changes in exchange rates and the prices of stocks and bonds fuel more instability and uncertainty. That chaos can turn market adjustments into financial crises and panics. The financial markets lose their ability to perform the important function of allocating investment funds and reflecting underlying economic conditions. 2 weeks ago, it looked like there was going to be a disaster. That disaster was averted and calmed. It is critical that the calm remain, and we continue to contribute toward that calm by providing appropriate contributions to the International Monetary Fund for America's sake, for America's economic stability. I ask some of my Republican colleagues who want to block the funding for the International Monetary Fund and attach highly volatile issues to the legislation, such as the Mexico City anti-abortion legislation. I ask them to ask themselves if they understand that they will only be undermining the United States efforts in stabilizing markets around the world. These issues must be resolved separately. This is a critical time that calls for a united effort. I thank the gentleman for coming here and addressing these concerns.
Mr. Lazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to welcome also the Chairman and Secretary. Good to see you again. Just putting things in perspective, there have been some valid points that have been made, I think, by my colleagues, but let's keep in mind this. If one of our concerns is to increase and enhance average wages for Americans, one of the best strategies of doing that is to ensure that we have a growing share of the world market and that we increase trade. The problem is not just Indonesia, it is global deflation. And to the extent that there is deflationary pressure worldwide that has an impact on our markets, on our ability to export, we're going to affect our own jobs. Emerging Asian markets account for about 20% of all of our exports. Take into account Japan, you're talking about 1/3 of all of our export dollars. So to the extent that these economies deflate or disintegrate, this is going to have a very lasting, sustained impact on our ability to create not just jobs, but good jobs, because jobs tied to trade, statistically and empirically, command higher salaries than those that are attached to sort of domestic output. So I make that point. I also make the point that there were those who wrung their hands over the peso destabilization efforts only a short while ago, saying we would lose money and we were bailing out a regime that ought not to be helped. The fact was that increased deflationary pressure in Mexico has had a positive impact as we've had destabilization of the peso. That means fewer people, fewer workers have been displaced. It means that we are beginning to increase our exports again. And it means that we have more political stability on our border. All those things are very good. And on top of that, we actually made money on the deal. I don't know what the exact number was, but I think it was $1 or $2 billion that we actually earned, so we had a return to the taxpayers. That's an example of an arrangement that actually works for the American people. So let's keep all that in mind when we discuss this subject. Yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Hinchey.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you very much for holding this hearing. I think it's a very critical subject, and I think it can, it really needs the broadest possible open discussion. And Mr. Greenspan, I thank you for being here, and Mr. Summers as well. I want to just start by making the observation that I have made on other occasions such as this with regard to interest rates. And this is something that the minutes of the August meeting of the Open Market Committee reflects. In that meeting, there was an observation made that real interest rates are high by historical standards. And I think that we need to pay attention to that. It is important, I believe, in the context of this Asian situation, that the Federal Reserve in future meetings consider reducing the real interest rate substantially so that we can minimize on our economy the effect of the deflation that is occurring in the Asian economies and, for that matter, around the world. I would anticipate that in your testimony today that we will hear from you something about the overproduction that exists in the world economy, here in the United States, in Asia, and in Europe. That overproduction exists throughout the industrial sector. It exists in cars, it exists in semiconductors, it exists in the chemical industry. All of the major aspects of industrial economies are experiencing overproduction at the moment. The effect of that on not just disinflation, but deflation, not just in Asia, but elsewhere in the world, including potentially the United States, is devastating. And that is something that we need to look at very, very carefully. And that is why I'm suggesting to you once again that the Federal Reserve has held interest rates, for real interest rates, too high for too long. The experience of 1994 was devastating to the economy, and those interest rate increases, 7 over a 12-month period, injured this economy, and we have not recovered fully from that injury. And furthermore, as the point has been made, that the economic benefits that we have seen have not flown equitably in the economy, and that is a factor that is contributing to the overproduction. And we need to, interest rates can obviously affect that. So I just hope that we will have an opportunity to examine the U.S. trade deficits. I think the U.S. trade deficit is going to worsen. We have seen a devaluation of Asian economies, 35% devaluation in the Chinese currency, and an average of 17 to 20% devaluation generally throughout Asian currencies. That, of course, is going to make their exports cheaper. It is going to make our exports more expensive and more difficult for us. We are currently exporting about 30% of our exports go to Asia. We can expect that number to fall. About 35% of our imports come from Asia. We can expect that number to rise. That will have a profound effect on our economy in both the short and the long term. So I think that we are facing a situation worldwide of disinflation and potentially deflation. And the Asian economies are currently exporting deflation into the United States. And I think also that this has to be seen in the context of what is occurring in Germany. The German nations, under their obligation to meet the requirements of the Maastricht Treaty, are fluctuating their economies and interest rates. The Germans have just raised interest rates. They are already facing a very serious problem of overproduction in that country, much worse than we are facing here, and ours is getting worse. So we are facing, I believe, a very serious global economic problem. It is a problem of disinflation leading into deflation, and it is exacerbated by the high rates of interest in Europe and here in the United States, real interest rates. And I hope that the Federal Reserve, in its future meetings, will pay close attention to this, and we can anticipate reductions in real interest rates so that we can have a counter effect on the disinflation and deflation that is going on around the world, and also so that more of the people of this country can begin to enjoy the benefits of what economic growth we have had over the course of the last several years. And I will look forward to your comments on these issues, and I thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman,
I thank the gentleman.
the members on this side are ready to hear from Mr. Greenspan.
Let me say that we've gone for a full hour, and I think many perspectives have been reflected. And if there's no great objection, I'd like to ask if other members would put opening statements in the record. And hearing no objection to that approach, I'd like to introduce Chairman Greenspan, and we welcome you to this committee for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Recent developments in world finance have highlighted growing interactions among national financial markets. The underlying technology-based structure of the international financial system has enabled us to improve materially the efficiency of the flows of capital and payment systems. That improvement, however, has also enhanced the ability of the financial system to transmit problems in one part of the globe to another quite rapidly. Doubtless, there is much to be learned from the recent experience in Asia that can be applied to better the workings of the international financial system and its support of international trade that has done so much to enhance living standards worldwide. While each of the Asian economies differs in many important respects, the sources of their spectacular growth in recent years, in some cases decades, and the problems that have emerged are relevant to a greater or lesser extent to nearly all of them. Following the early post-World War II period, policies generally fostered low levels of inflation and openness of their economies, coupled with high savings and investment rates, contributed to a sustained period of rapid growth, in some cases starting in the 1960s and 1970s. By the 1980s, most economies in the region were expanding vigorously. Foreign net capital inflows grew, but until recent years were relatively modest. The World Bank estimates that net inflows of long-term debt, foreign direct investment, and equity purchases to the Asia-Pacific region were only about $25 billion in 1990, but exploded to more than $110 billion by 1996. A major impetus behind this rapid expansion was the global stock market boom of the 1990s. As that boom progressed, investors in many industrial countries found themselves more heavily concentrated in the recently higher valued securities of companies in the developed world, whose rates of return in many instances had fallen to levels perceived as uncompetitive with the earnings potential in emerging economies, especially in Asia. The resultant diversification induced a sharp increase in capital flows into those economies. To a large extent, they came from investors in the United States and Western Europe. A substantial amount came from Japan as well, owing more to a search for higher yields than to rising stock prices and capital gains in that country. The rising yen through mid-1995 also encouraged a substantial increase in direct investment inflows from Japan. In retrospect, it is clear that more investment monies flowed into these economies than could be profitably employed at modest risk. I suspect it was inevitable in those conditions of low inflation, rapid growth, and ample liquidity that much investment moved into the real estate sector, with an emphasis by both the public and private sectors on conspicuous construction projects. This is an experience, of course, not unknown in the United States on occasion. These real estate assets, in turn, ended up as collateral for a significant proportion of the assets of domestic financial systems. In many instances, those financial systems were less than robust, beset with problems of lax lending standards, weak supervisory regimes, and inadequate capital. Moreover, in most cases, the currencies of these economies were closely tied to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar's substantial recovery since mid-1995, especially relative to the yen, made their exports less competitive. In addition, in some cases, the glut of semiconductors in 1996 suppressed export growth, exerting further pressures on highly leveraged businesses. However, overall GDP growth rates generally edged off only slightly, and imports fostered by rising real exchange rates continued to expand, contributing to what became unsustainable current account deficits in a number of these economies. Moreover, with exchange rates seeming to be solidly tied to the dollar, and with dollar and yen interest rates lower than domestic currency rates, a significant part of the enlarged capital inflows into these economies, in particular short-term flows, was denominated by the ultimate borrowers in foreign currencies. This put additional pressure on companies to earn foreign exchange through exports. The pressure on fixed exchange rate regimes mounted as foreign investors slowed the pace of new capital inflows, and domestic businesses sought increasingly to convert domestic currencies into foreign currencies, or equivalently, slowed the conversion of export earnings into domestic currencies. The shifts in perceived future investment risks led to sharp declines in stock markets across Asia, often on top of earlier declines or lackluster performances. To date, the direct impact of these developments on the American economy has been modest, but it can be expected not to be negligible. U.S. exports to Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, the 4 countries initially affected, were about 4% of total U.S. exports in 1996. However, an additional 12% went to Hong Kong, Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, economies that have been affected more recently. Thus, depending on the extent of the inevitable slowdown in growth in this area of the world, the growth of our exports will tend to be muted. Our direct foreign investment in and foreign affiliate earnings reported from the economies in this region as a whole have been a smaller share of the respective totals than their share of our exports. The share is nonetheless large enough to expect some drop-off in those earnings in the period ahead. In addition, there will be indirect effects on the U.S. real economy from countries such as Japan that compete even more extensively with the economies in the Asian region. Particularly troublesome over the past several months has been the so-called contagion effect of weaknesses in one economy spreading to others as investors perceive, rightly or wrongly, similar vulnerabilities. Even economies such as Hong Kong, with formidable stocks of international reserves, balanced external accounts, and relatively robust financial systems, have experienced severe pressures. One can debate whether the turbulence in Latin American asset values reflects contagion effects from Asia, the influence of developments in U.S. financial markets, or homegrown causes. Whatever the answer, and the answer may be all of the above, this phenomenon illustrates the interdependencies in today's world economy and financial system. Perhaps it was inevitable that the impressive and rapid growth experienced by the economies in the Asian region would run into a temporary slowdown or pause. But there is no reason that above-average growth in countries that are still in a position to gain from catching up with the prevailing technology cannot persist for a very long time. Nevertheless, rapidly developing free market economies periodically can be expected to run into difficulties because investment mistakes are inevitable in any dynamic economy. Private capital flows may temporarily turn adverse. In these circumstances, companies should be allowed to default, private investors should take their losses, and government policy should be directed toward laying the macroeconomic and structural foundations for renewed expansion. New growth opportunities must be allowed to emerge. Similarly, in providing any international financial assistance, we need to be mindful of the desirability of minimizing the impression that international authorities stand ready to guarantee the external liabilities of sovereign governments or failed domestic businesses. To do otherwise could lead to distorted investments and could ultimately unbalance the world financial system. The recent experience in Asia underscores the importance of financially sound domestic banking and other associated financial institutions. While the current turmoil has significant interaction with the international financial system, the recent crises would arguably have been better contained if long maturity property loans had not accentuated the usual mismatch between maturities of assets and liabilities of domestic financial systems that were far from robust to begin with. Our unlamented savings and loan crisis comes immediately to mind. These are trying days for economic policymakers in Asia. They must fend off domestic pressures that seek disengagement from the world trading and financial system. The authorities in these countries are working hard, in some cases with substantial assistance from the IMF and the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, to stabilize their financial systems and economies. The financial disturbances that have afflicted a number of currencies in Asia do not at this point, as I indicated earlier, threaten prosperity in this country. But we need to work closely with their leaders and the international financial community to assure that their situation stabilize. It is in the interest of the United States and other nations around the world to encourage appropriate policy adjustments and, where required, provide temporary financial assistance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Secretary Summers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to discuss recent developments in Southeast Asian financial markets, which have been of considerable interest to this committee and other members of Congress. We at the Treasury broadly share Chairman Greenspan's diagnosis of the causes of these crises. I've submitted a more detailed analysis in my written statement for the record. But let me focus here on international efforts to respond to the crises and the principles guiding us in seeking to devise the best ways to respond to crises and promote financial stability over the longer term. Recent developments, to be sure, have serious ramifications for the countries that have been worst affected to date, and potentially quite significant implications for the United States and for the international financial system as a whole. While the crisis originated in Asia and has been most acutely felt in Asia to date, the associated turbulence has clearly affected many other important markets around the world. The United States has a very strong stake in the restoration of confidence, sustainable flows of capital, and a return to growth in countries where financial problems have been most serious. Equally, we have a strong stake in avoiding further contagion to other emerging economies. It is a stake based on the growing importance of these countries as markets for our exports, and it is a stake based on our recognition that a prosperous integrating Asia and a prosperous integrating global economy are very much in the strategic interest of this country. Treasury Department, working with the Federal Reserve, has been actively involved with other countries in the Asian Pacific region and the international financial institutions in supporting efforts to restore financial stability to Thailand and Indonesia and to prevent further contagion effects. Let me be clear, these efforts have not been motivated by charity or comity. They have been motivated by our concern with America's interest in a strong American economy as part of the world economy. In the case of Thailand, international assistance has been provided in the form of a $4 billion IMF standby facility, conditioned on the implementation of a major macroeconomic and financial reform program. This was supplemented by a further $13.2 billion in official and bilateral support from several countries, also conditioned on the IMF program. In addition, we joined others in agreeing to participate in providing short-term liquidity as a bridge to official disbursements, if that need should arise. Last month, the IMF and the Indonesian government announced a substantial support program for Indonesia, again conditioned on a strong effort to achieve an orderly adjustment of the domestic economy and to restore confidence to financial markets. This program included a wide range of measures to reform in a profound way economic governance in Indonesia, including measures to reduce connections between the government and private institutions, to curb monopolies, and to address problems in the banking sector. The program was centered on around a $10 billion IMF standby facility, supplemented in line with the IMF program by $8 billion from the World Bank and ADB, and a further $5 billion from Indonesia's own reserves. To support the program, the United States joined a number of other countries in the region in expressing a willingness to provide contingent financial support for Indonesia as a temporary second line of defense in the event that unanticipated external pressures gave rise to a need to supplement Indonesia's own reserves and the resources made available by the IMF. Our participation reflected our concerns about the risks of further contagion and our desire to join a number of other countries in showing our support to rebuild confidence for this program. I'd like to note that the United States has spoken out and continues to speak out within the World Bank and the IMF in advancing the purposes of the Frank Sanders Amendment by urging measures that would help improve the conditions of workers in Indonesia, Thailand, and across the developing world. Workers' rights issues, along with issues of corruption, governance, and military spending, will remain important priorities for us in the international financial institution in the months and years ahead. There is, I believe, broad agreement that an effective approach to problems of this kind must focus on preventative measures to increase transparency and to guard against the creation of large domestic imbalances and strengthen domestic financial system. And when problems arise, must focus on strong, credible domestic policy response in the countries concerned. There will, however, be circumstances where it will be important to mobilize international support to restore financial stability. Thinking through the appropriate mechanisms for such assistance, it will be important, in our view, to remember three principles. First, the principle of country and investor responsibility. While external assistance can play an important role, the primary burden of responsibility for both preventing and responding effectively to crises must continue to fall on the countries concerned. It is critical that in a global capital market, investment flows be based on investors' perceptions of the underlying fundamentals of each country and not on the probability of some kind of international support. The second principle, following from the first, is that the IMF must remain at the heart of any international response. Its unique ability to provide apolitical, conditioned finance in the context of, and only in the context of, strong reforms makes it the appropriate vehicle for providing support. We must therefore ensure the IMF has the financial means and modes to act promptly and effectively. I would note here that important added resource capacity to enable the IMF to carry out its critical work would be made available by the new arrangements to borrow. And it is my hope that the administration's request to participate in the new arrangement to borrow, which is still pending before Congress, will be acted on favorably before the Congress adjourns for the year. Our third principle is to ensure that regional cooperative arrangements complement the global objective of safeguarding financial stability. To this end, we are exploring arrangements that would give the countries of the Asia-Pacific region a larger stake and voices in decisions affecting them, and would, importantly, reinforce the IMF's capacity to act quickly and effectively at time of crisis. In this context, as we have said before, we believe a forum for enhanced surveillance among countries in the Asia-Pacific region would be a useful step. Any cooperative regional financing arrangement must be designed with great care to limit moral hazard risks. It would have to be restricted for use in association with IMF programs, only be made available to supplement resources provided by the IMF and a country's own reserves, not risk undermining the IMF's position as the major global provider of stabilization assistance, and, critically, give countries flexibility to determine whether their participation is appropriate in any given case. With their high rates of savings and investment, strong outward orientation, and tradition of sound macroeconomic policymaking, Thailand, Indonesia, and other Southeast Asian economies have been among the fastest-growing economies in the world in recent years. These same strengths leave them well-placed to achieve a rapid return to rapid growth once confidence can be restored. But recent events have underscored that being a member of the more integrated world economy brings risks as well as opportunities. and that governments and investors in Southeast Asia are no more immune to these risks than anyone else. The task for all of us will be to develop policies and institutions to minimize such risks and give us the means to respond to difficulties promptly and effectively. I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, with this committee, and with others in Congress, as well as our partners in the Asia-Pacific region and elsewhere, as we seek to meet this vital challenge. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Secretary Summers. Before beginning the questioning, let me announce that we have a new member of our committee, Mr. Vito Fasella, who comes to us from Long Island. Vito is a graduate of Staten Island. I apologize, Vito. In any regard, Vito is a graduate of Fordham University Law School and the Wharton School of Business, and we're proud that he's a new member of this body, and we welcome you in your presence in this Congress. Let me just first ask a question by background to our two distinguished panelists. How do you relate this current Asian-generated circumstance or crisis to the Mexico circumstance of 2 years ago? Is it more or less serious? What are the analogies and what are the differences?
There are important similarities and important differences. In common, one has the situation of an emerging market with a weak financial system that has encountered large capital inflows and that then encounters financial strains with consequent pressures from both domestic and international investors. In common, one has the element that problems in one country lead investors to reassess situations in other countries, leading to contagion effects. In the situation in Mexico, because of the extremely large accumulation of short-term debt, we faced a situation in January of 1995 where Mexico was within a small number of days of possible default. A situation of that kind has not arisen to date in Southeast Asia. The crucial lesson of the Mexican crisis, most important lesson for events in Southeast Asia, in our view, is the importance of a strong domestic policy response. The Mexican authorities' courageous steps to repair their financial system, to pursue sound policies, to stabilize financial conditions, had a great deal to do, were the primary reason for the restoration of confidence, which led to large capital inflows into Mexico, and as you know, Mr. Chairman, made possible an early repayment of the support that had been provided by the United States. And I might say that those sound policies have served Mexico well in the face of the turbulence that now exists in many emerging markets.
Mr. Greenspan.
Well, I would agree generally with what the Deputy Secretary said, and I would add only that what we are learning, indeed from both these episodes and previous ones as well, is the crucial importance of the financial system in these sorts of crises. There has been, as I indicated in my prepared remarks, a fairly strong inclination on the part of financial institutions to lend long, largely in real estate of one form or another, finance short-term too often with foreign liabilities. And that will work and that will be profitable for a considerable period of time until something untoward occurs. And it will then what has clearly occurred in too many instances is that the risks that were being taken in the financial system to achieve inordinately large rates of return in too many cases turned out to be mistakes. And one of the issues which I think we are learning in this process is the importance of making certain that financial institutions, especially banks, which are by nature highly leveraged and are involved in very substantial interbank lending, that these institutions be bolstered in a manner in which they don't add to the contagion either domestically or internationally.
I think you have a second question, but I don't want to, since we have so many members here, to proceed with it, but I would like to end with one modest observation. One of the ideas on the table comes from Japan of creating a new Asian Development Fund, which might have U.S. participation. I think I speak for the majority of members in suggesting it would be very awkward at this time to assume congressional support. We're going to have a hard time getting support for the NAB and the regular IMF replenishment, and a new fund would be very difficult. Secondly, I think, as has been indicated by other speakers, Congress shares the administration view on an IMF-centric conditionality approach, and that programs that are not structured within IMF conditionality would be, I think, ill-advised from our perspective. Mr. LaFalce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A number of concerns, most of them addressed to Dr. Summers, but in some instances to Chairman Greenspan also. First of all, I was wondering about the international political dynamics. We did not intervene in any significant way with respect to Thailand. I was wondering the political repercussions of that, and if that was a contributing factor in our agreement to intervene in a contingent way with Indonesia. Secondly, I want to underscore the fact that although I did not sign the letter circulated by Mr. Frank, I strongly support every word of that letter, with the exception of the last paragraph, which called upon the U.S. Treasury not to assist in Indonesia. I think there was a strong case for assistance, but I think that that strong case is difficult to maintain and prevail unless the Clinton administration gives much more emphasis to these labor rights issues and human rights issues in the future. I think it was imperative, though, that the United States participate in this Asian difficulty at the risk of looking as if they were anti-Asia. Third, I want both of you, Dr. Greenspan and Mr. Summers, to address the role of Taiwan in this currency devaluation problem. Did Taiwan adequately defend its currency? Did Taiwan deliberately, on the eve of President Jiang Zemin's visit to the United States, attempt to destabilize the Hong Kong currency? Have they acted in an unfriendly, hostile way, referring to international norms of behavior? And then lastly, what about a warning system? Shouldn't we have been aware of this? What were we doing, what were we saying to help mitigate this, at least Asian crash that took place? Those are my questions.
Perhaps I might begin our response. On the question of warning, Congressman, I believe the best thing that we can do to promote surveillance is to work as we have in the IMF, and we'll need to continue to work to ensure a maximum of transparency in global economic management, because it is with the availability of information on national economic practices, on reserve levels, on the health of banking systems, that investors can make the best possible judgments. And because, as somebody once said, conscience is the fear that someone is watching, the effort to encourage transparency will in turn encourage sound policies and the avoidance of mistakes like the excessive depletion of reserves. I know of no evidence that Taiwan's decision was based on anything other than the economic conditions that Taiwan found itself facing in the context of what was happening in Asian financial markets generally, and the pressures that they were experiencing. We share very strongly your concern, the concern of Congressman Frank and Kennedy and Sanders about worker rights and about a whole set of issues thrown up by policies in Asia, and work very actively through the international financial institutions to encourage evolution in the direction that we favor. I believe that the Indonesian program does go to many of the critical issues that have concerned people about governance in Indonesia for quite some time, and in particular represents important steps that affect family control of the Indonesian economy.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to point out that Taiwan, before it moved its rate down, actually was endeavoring to support the rate and apparently had run through several $1 billion worth of reserves in order to do that. We know of no evidence to suggest that there's been any concerted political action of the type that you're suggesting. So we see no reason to anyway dispute the conclusions that the Treasury Department has brought forth with respect to that issue.
Mr. McCullough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm interested in knowing, Chairman Greenspan and Secretary Summers, what you both think about whether the devaluations in Thailand, Taiwan, Indonesia were the wrong thing for them to do, and did the International Monetary Fund influence those devaluations, encourage them to occur, and related to that, who's right? The Wall Street Journal that yesterday said these devaluations will make it more costly to buy imports and ultimately devaluations produce inflation, or those who are saying that what we're facing in the aftermath of the crisis in Southeast Asia will be global deflation. I'm confused by the arguments, and I'd like to know your wisdom on both whether the devaluations were a good idea, did the IMF encourage them, and what do the results mean? Will they produce inflation ultimately in those countries, or will they produce a path to potentially global deflation?
Well, I think the issue is, in a certain sense, misstated. At the point in which the devaluations took place, they had no choice. They were running out of reserves. There was no way they could support their currencies. So that the question that really has to be on the table is, do devaluations help a country? The answer is they do not. They may, in the short run, create some competitive advantages, but very shortly that is eroded by inflation and those competitive advantages rapidly disappear. One cannot argue that devaluation is a positive factor in anybody's economy. The issue is, the question should really readily have been asked, what could those countries have done earlier on to structure their economies in such a manner in which they would not face the inevitable run on reserves and the really quite irresistible pressures on their exchange rates. Once you get to a certain point, it's not an issue of will, it's an issue of inevitability. I think the real important issue is how do you set up an economy's structure and financial institutions and overall policies in a manner which are consistent with a specific exchange rate, and then one will not find the problem of having continuously to try to defend it.
So we'll likely see ultimate inflation in those countries as a result of what they had to do, as you put it, not disinflation.
Unless they take actions now which restructure the economies in a manner which effectively avoid that.
Do they have, I'm going to ask Mr. Summers to respond, but I'm curious, Mr. Greenspan, do these countries have relatively independent central banks like the United States, or are they like much of the world which have continued to have their executive branch control the central bank?
The issues of central banking and finance, which we have very strong traditions on, rarely exist in those countries. And you even have the serious question as to whether, in fact, the private external liabilities denominated in foreign currencies are de facto insured or guaranteed by governments or central banks. In short, the sharp divisions that we have in this country and in other developing nations, and do in fact exist in some emerging nations, as a general rule, are not a worldwide phenomenon.
Mr. Summers, as we have to run to vote in a second, can you generally respond? Do you agree with Mr. Greenspan that the devaluations were a good thing, a necessary thing, and will they be? They were necessary. They're inevitable. And do you believe they'll be inflationary, as he suggested, ultimately?
I agree with what the chairman said. At the point they took place, I think they were inevitable, given the pressures on those economies,
including Taiwan.
I am less familiar with the details of the situation in Taiwan, but I believe
they've been criticized for competitive, devaluations, which is, with a strong, they were a much stronger position in their economy. But go ahead. I'm running out of my time and yours. I apologize.
I believe the devaluations result from the pressures that come from inconsistent monetary policies and exchange rate policies, and the only solution, as the chairman suggests, is for those policies to be made consistent at an earlier stage.
Will they ultimately be inflationary?
I would expect that the devaluations will lead to somewhat higher rates of inflation, perhaps not too much higher if sound policies are pursued in the countries in question. The effect of the lower prices, effect of the reduction in costs of producing in those countries will be some reduction in the prices of the goods they sell, and therefore some, I judge, quite modest reduction in inflationary pressure in other parts of the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McCollum. We do have a vote. It's to be followed by another vote, and so the committee is in recess, subject to the voting on the floor.
Yeah, I know. That's okay. I was looking for it. I was like, that looks like my...
committee will reconvene. Mr. Venno.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a number of questions. I think the questions that my colleague, Mr. Frank, raised with regards to his amendment and the other qualifications or stipulations that we placed in terms of IMF legislation are important. I don't know. I guess the question is, and I think it's a question that is in a circumstance of immediacy. I won't use the word crisis. Whether or not these types of these goals and how they fit in, and so I think it becomes important to set the stage, the groundwork, and for these particular prerequisites ahead of time, and consequently, of course, back into the topic of the day in terms of trade and other issues. So I do think that we need to establish those. In fact, I think the functioning of these economies in the absence of democratization, a free economy, and free people is very difficult. Which there are a number of things that I have. I mean, my three questions are basically on the IMF capacity to deal with this and the secondary nature of our unilateral intervention or assistance, and the capacity of the IMF. I mean, does it have the authority and the resources given the magnitude of the crisis in the Pacific Rim today and on a global basis, and then added to that our own, what's the expectation that we're going to have with this? All of a sudden, of course, this is going forward, but we see in one case $3 billion that the United States put up. It's likely that we would have other such arrangements, I guess. In fact, we've had such with key economies on our border, and of course at that time we were suggesting that we were taking the lead. Here, of course, other nations are taking the lead with other independent actions backing this up in the case of Japan. But again, that economy is having its problems. So that's my issue, is the whole issue, the IMF capacity in terms of the specific multilateral tool that we have for liquidity and for stabilization, and then the individual countries. Then my other question, maybe this, you can take these in the order that you want, but what is the impact of China as becoming a more active participant and presence in these Asian markets? To us, of course, it looms very large because of the amount of trade that we have with them, but I'm curious as to what the impact. I think my impression is that Japan plays a much more important role with these developing nations in the Pacific Rim currently than does China, but I'm wondering if some of the adjustments and some of the uncertainty and instability that is present here is due to the Hong Kong market and the presence of the Chinese economy posed to integrate itself into that Pacific Rim. So those are my questions, and I'll then yield to and ask the governor of the Fed and Dr. Summers to respond. Mr. Greenspan.
Well, Congressman, I think that it's fairly obvious in the sense when one looks at the data that Japan has a fairly significant stake. 44% of their trade is with Asian countries, and they have very significant investments throughout Southeast Asia. So there's no doubt that Japan is a very substantial interests. China is obviously the rapidly growing country and is potentially very substantial, obviously, because of its 1.2 billion population and very substantial growth over a number of years, which against that base of population is potentially very large economic force, especially in Asia. I don't say that one should look at this as a zero-sum game, as one's benefit is another's loss. On the contrary, I think it's the evidence that is increasingly overwhelming on a worldwide scale that trade has been a very major force in engendering rising standards of living throughout the world, not the least of which has been our standard of living. So I think there's a general view abroad that we are all trying to enhance, one, rapid growth in international trade in goods and services, and two, a international financial system which fosters that to the maximum extent. So in that regard, we all have very strong concerns that the contagion that has occurred and the weakness that has occurred in the Asian markets be stabilized as quickly as possible, because, as I indicated in my prepared remarks, while this may be inevitable in a very dynamic financial system, nonetheless, these contagion problems slow down overall world economic growth, including our own, and that as soon as we can get them resolved, the better. It's in everybody's interest, and especially the interest of the United States, that this weakness in the Asian economic and financial system be reversed as quickly as feasible.
Mr. Summers, did you, my time has elapsed, but maybe you could respond briefly to my inquiries.
I think Chairman Greenspan stated exactly my views on the question of China's role and Japan's role. I would just add by saying that I think you are right to emphasize the importance of the IMF as the primary vehicle of support for crises like this, the enormous benefit that we as Americans derive from having an institution that shares the burden of responding to these kinds of problems in a multilateral way and is in a position to impose conditionality so as to ensure that domestic policies are as healthy as they can be to bring about changes in these situations, and that we will continue, as we have since the Mexico crisis, to work to strengthen the IMF's capacity to respond through its emergency financing mechanism. It is of particular importance in that regard that as rapidly as possible the new arrangement to borrow be authorized and come into force, and so that in the event that it is necessary, extra liquidity can be provided to the IMF on a risk-free basis from the point of view of the countries providing the liquidity, so that the IMF is adequately positioned to take the central role in responding to problems like those that we've seen.
Well, I think maybe we can answer in more detail in writing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Ruck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was not here for all of Mr. Vento's questions, so I hope I'm not repeating anything here. But in both your testimonies, by the way, you gave a very lucid overview of the reality of the global economy as it relates to these markets. And in both your testimonies, there are inferences, but nothing specific. Maybe you don't want to be specific, but there are inferences as to whether or not there might be needed new regulatory authority or new oversight in these areas. I don't want to go into particular, well, for example, in Mr. Summer, he concluded by saying, the task for all of us is to develop policies and institutions to minimize the risk. And Chairman Greenspan said it in another way. Do you have any recommendations for either how we deal with the existing institutions to have more regulatory authority, or as Mr. LaFalce referred to it earlier, and I don't remember your addressing it specifically, as to what early warning systems there might be? And in that context, the chairman referred to the savings and loan crisis as coming to mind. Are there early warning systems we should put in? Is there new regulatory authority, or do we require new legislation or new requirements of whether it's IMF, World Bank, or the banks that the chairman referred to that are highly leveraged and the question of their relationship to adding to the contagion. I don't know that what the implication was there, but could you just give us an overview of your approach?
Yes. As I indicated in both my prepared remarks and in answer to an earlier question, the more I have observed these types of problems, international financial problems with contagion arise, the more I get concerned that our banking systems too often are either the catalyst or something which exacerbates the nature of the problem. In this regard, early on, the Bank for International Settlements, with whom we deal, it's a vehicle through which numbers of central banks work together. Through the auspices of the Bank for International Settlements, a fairly general code of capital requirements and related regulatory issues have been developed, generally accepted voluntarily by large numbers of countries. In addition, there has been recent discussions that the IMF and the World Bank, in their evaluations of individual countries, would employ these general principles promulgated by the Bank for International Settlements, the so-called Basel Committee on Supervision, and apply them to the individual countries' cases when they bring conditionality, for example, in their loans to these countries. They are trying to find means by which they can use the generic principles of the BIS to specific recommendations with respect to individual banking structures. And I'm sure that Secretary Summers, who used to be very closely involved with World Bank economic issues when he was associated with that agency, knows a good deal more about that than I. But what I do know is that it is essential that in going forward with the rapidly changing international financial structure that seems to be getting larger and larger every day and will continue to do so because it serves a useful purpose. As an offshoot of that, it is important that we make certain that these wide variety of banking structures around the world are capable of effectively dealing with that system in a manner which doesn't create significant problems for themselves, and because we're all involved with that structure, to other economies as well.
I would just echo what the chairman said, that the central regulatory imperative is a strengthening of the domestic regulatory capacity in emerging markets. And the G7 launched an initiative, the fruits of which the chairman described at the Lyon summit, that was directed at promulgating standards and then working to ensure that there was effective surveillance to ensure that those standards were complied with through the IMF and the World Bank. One element of the development of effective financial systems in developing countries that I would stress is openness to foreign participation, because we found in many cases that openness to foreign participation is an important source of stability because of the knowledge about best and most modern practices that foreign institutions bring, and because foreign institutions have external capital that stands behind them. And I think that one of the things we'll have to do over the years ahead is promote openness of developing countries with respect to foreign financial institutions as a source of stability. And the chairman reminds me that I think the other crucial, in a sense, regulatory imperative is transparency. transparency because if you look at the history of the American capital market, I would suggest to you that the idea of generally accepted accounting principles was probably as important as any other single step in the development of the kind of capital market that we have in the United States. And I think transparency with respect to providing information on all types of financial variables is something that is critical.
Well, our time is up, but could I request that if you have, I don't know whether I can assume by your answers that you feel that the legislation is adequate in and of itself.
You're talking about U.S. legislation?
Well, both.
I don't see, aside from the various different initiatives which Treasury has put forth with respect to various funding arrangements, I don't think that we legislation that is required. I think we've got the structure that I think is necessary. So further authorities I don't believe are necessary.
All right. Well, if you have anything to add, would you please put it in writing for us? And I'd appreciate it, and we'll make it part of the record. I do appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say I very much appreciate you having this hearing. I think this is as important an issue as is affecting us right now, and your willingness to have this hearing today when people are otherwise distracted is something I appreciate, and your indulgence in letting us deal with this. I want to reiterate, before I get into my questions, I do believe we are at a very critical period here, and if we are not able to do a better job of showing people that we can combine globalization and modernization with some concern for equity, we are going to stumble. And I hope that this is part of a process of getting beyond that. And Mr. Greenspan, let me ask you, I mentioned earlier to you I was going to raise this. Obviously, there's a good deal of concern here about the recessionary effects here. Obviously, it's going to mean a great drop in growth in the Asian economies themselves that are affected. There will be some carryover to us. What worries, obviously, all of us is the notion that there's a kind of a macroeconomic drag here to some degree. And it's in that context that I raised the question about our continuing to argue that inflation is the graver danger. And I understand there are some factors that lead you to think that, but one point suggested to me by Jude Winitsky, as I mentioned here, and it seems to me a reasonable thing to raise here, is the question of the gold price. Because what he and others have represented is that, for instance, in 1994, which was the last time interest rates were raised by the Fed, who moved in that direction, the high price of gold was taken as one indication of inflationary expectations. People have argued that you and some others have historically said the price of gold is an inflationary indicator. The fact is that gold is now at a very low rate. And so the question is, how do you reconcile an historic view, not that you're old enough to be historic, Mr. Greenspan, a consistent view over time to regard the gold price as an indicator of inflation, with the fact that gold is now at a very, very low rate? Does that not mean, does that mean that inflation is not much of a problem, or has gold for some reason become the gold price an irrelevancy when it comes to indications of inflation?
No, I don't think it's become irrelevant. I've argued, and I would continue to argue, that it's a meaningful tool to evaluate the expectations of inflation, which, if you're talking about the gold price denominated in dollars, then it's one of the major indicators that we would employ to make judgments about the degree of inflation expectations.
And it's very low right now, isn't it, by historic standards?
No, but you know, at current price, we're still more than 9 times what we were a generation ago. I mean, it's not.
Well,
the price
we've
is
had
down.
some very different changes. We've had some changes that account for that.
Well, you know, it's an interesting. That is a very important question, and I don't think we know fully the answer to that. But there's no doubt that the decline in gold price in the recent past parallels the decline in inflation expectations, which we see elsewhere. I don't think there's any question that the Asian crisis has imparted a degree of disinflation to the rest of the world. I think that's fairly evident, and I don't think we've fully seen the full impact of that as yet. But you have to remember that a goodly part of that impact is coming in the form of goods, tradable goods. And tradable goods, while important to our economy, reflect a not very large part of the overall business structure that we've got. If you take non-farm business, goods production is a third of it. It's not, the big part is services.
I understand, although a third's a pretty big chunk of the economy.
Sure, no, it's
so let me ask one other question, because this is something which I know you touched on in your Joint Economic Committee testimony. Am I correct in understanding that your view is that one of the major constraints in our ability to continue to grow at the current rate without inflation is the size of the workforce, and
yes,
that you believe that we are in fact absorbing workers at a rate that may prove to be unsustainable?
Well, I merely pointed out the arithmetic of what the data show, namely that the number of additions to the working age population who wish a job, remember that excludes students, which are increasing quite significantly, that number, which is, one must presume, the sustainable rate of growth of employment over the longer run, is a number significantly below what the rate of growth of employment has been in recent years.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just ask, if I could, for one more minute to say, first, Mr. Greenspan, other people are entitled to invoke mere arithmetic. With you, I'm afraid it is prophecy, whether you like it or not. You're not allowed the luxury of mere arithmetic. I think when you talk, people are going to draw policy implications. And I would like to draw one from this, which is that given what you say and given your view that this is a constraint, is not a logical answer increased immigration as the only way that we can, in fact, increase the workforce? If we did the right kind of immigration, you would have people eligible to join the workforce, which would make the right kind of immigration, in fact, a good thing for the economy rather than a problem.
Well, of the increase that we have in the working age population who wish to work, a third are immigrants.
I appreciate your confirmation of my point of before that a third is sometimes a big number and not a small number. Because I take it you cited a third there as a significant factor. But in other words, if we were to tighten up...
I didn't say whether it was large or small. I said it was a third.
I think the eyebrow suggested it was large, but significant. Let's say significant. But does that then not mean that if we were, in fact, to reduce immigration substantially, we would exacerbate the problem of being able to grow in a non-inflationary way?
I think we would.
Thank you.
More than a third of the gentleman's time has expired. Mr. B. Ryder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a chairman of the Asia Pacific Subcommittee, I was looking forward to having a hearing like this, but hearing that you were going to do this, this is the proper venue, so I commend you for doing it. I'm a little frustrated with the way we spent our first hour, despite the individual wisdom of my colleagues, but I'm not going to pursue that any further. There are 2 points, Secretary Summers, in your statement that I think need to be highlighted because I think they answer a lot of people's questions. They weren't said, and I'm just going to read them quickly. With respect to the unsustainable mix of monetary and exchange rate policies, you said Thailand and others increasingly faced a choice between raising interest rates to save an exchange rate peg or cutting interest rates to keep insolvent banks afloat. In many cases, the very delay meant that their actions were insufficient to achieve either objectives. And later, on a different point, much speculated, you said short-term speculative flows were not the major source of the pressure on governments. Overwhelmingly, these flows were driven by domestic investors losing confidence in their own country's currencies and seeking to diversify their holdings, often in response to new information. I think those bear highlighting. I'd like to talk about the domestic banking systems of these countries. Mrs. Rockman has already pursued that slightly. One of the witnesses on the second panel will say the following in their written statement. Weak and inefficient financial sectors were a pervasive and central cause of the crisis throughout the region. And Chairman Greenspan, you in your testimony underscore the importance of financially sound domestic banking and other associated financial institutions. Mr. Summers, you've got something very similar in your statement where you well, I can't find it, but you go to the discussion we had before about transparency, adequate capitalization, adequate financial supervision of domestic banking systems. I hope that, in fact, we're all on track if we have that emphasis and we're not just trying to pursue worthy objectives and suggesting these had a bigger role than they might have had in what happened in Southeast Asia. But in any case, I noted what one of you said, Mr. Chairman Greenspan, I believe, about the possibility that the Basel principles could be applied by the IMF. And perhaps it's possible in light of what the WTO negotiations are doing on liberalization of financial services, which is supposed to be due, I think, December 12th. And possibly in light of the Vancouver meeting of APEC, is it now possible for us to do something concrete as a government with the help of other governments to assure that, in fact, by the Basel principles being applied, by using APEC, which can be enlarged to the WTO, that we began to see some improvement in those domestic banking systems? Can we take those steps as a government? Are we willing to do that? Will that be a priority? Or should we admit that our rhetoric is overblown, that these were not major contributing factors?
Well, I remember a general discussion of the Basel principles in Stockholm 2 or 3 years ago. I was startled by how many countries were represented to try to understand and find means by which these individual countries could apply those principles to their domestic banking institutions. So I don't believe it's an issue of a Basel, Bank for International Settlements, the IMF, the United States, anybody trying to impose principles on individual countries. I think they're seeking ways to solidify their financial structures, which in very many instances are fragile, because they increasingly recognize the importance of finance in the development of standards of living within their own countries. The crucial question, however, is that it's not a simple issue of bringing a sophisticated banking system to an emerging nation. The development of experienced loan officers who fully understand the nature of market risk and what constitutes appropriate lending practices is a very difficult issue to advance. So I don't think that we need to press them very hard. They want to, and I think we should very much try to find means by which we can assist them to do that. We at the Federal Reserve have been engaged for a number of years. We're in extending assistance to individual banking organizations around the world because we recognize that it's to our interest that finance become far more sophisticated than it is, because it serves everybody's purpose, and it is an essential component for the issues of trade, cross borders, and rising standards of living. To the extent that the IMF and the World Bank, in its conditionality, can sharply focus these questions, I think is very much to the interest of the individual recipients of contingent aid, and it is certainly to the interest of the G7 and especially the United States.
I might just add, Congressman, that this is a critical priority for us. This is something that we have focused on, and in light of recent developments, will be focused on with greatly increased intensity within APEC as we address the as we address the Asian region. The context of the WTO allows us to discuss the particular role of foreign financial institutions, which, as I suggested, is important to developing integrity. And as the Chairman suggested, the international financial institutions have a critical role. I would caution that this is work that will take a long time to complete, because the question of a healthy financial system is really very much suffused with the question of a healthy economy. Issues of credit culture, of the establishment of property rights, of a judiciary that can enforce bankruptcies, can enforce property rights. Issues of basic government integrity are crucial to an effective financial system. One of the things that I think is most important about the IMF program for both Indonesia and Thailand is that it contains a set of quite specific conditionality addressing the need to close failed financial institutions and to stop pouring liquidity into them, and in crucial cases to wipe out the equity of crucial shareowners, because it is both a healthy regulatory framework and a willingness, as we've learned in the United States, to take prompt action when institutions are in trouble that is essential to developing a healthy financial system.
Thank you, gentlemen, for very good responses.
Mr. Sanders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and like many of the other members, I want to congratulate you on holding this very, very important hearing. And with your permission, I'd like to enter into the record some information that I think is relevant to this issue. And what I would like to do is, given the fact that Mr. Greenspan and I have on occasion dialogued already, I would like the privilege of maybe just chatting with Mr. Summers. And given the fact that we don't have a whole lot of time, Mr. Summers, I'd appreciate it if you could answer my questions as briefly as you might be able to. Mr. Summers, do you disagree with the statement from the U.S. State Department's annual Human Rights Report, and I quote, "Despite a surface adherence to democratic forms, the Indonesian political system remains strongly authoritarian. The government is dominated by an elite comprising President Suharto, now in his 6th five-year term, his close associates in the military." Do you agree with that?
I agree with that statement.
Thank you. Do you agree that Mukhtar Pakpahan, one of the leaders of the free trade union movement in Indonesia, is currently rotting in jail on trumped-up charges? That's what human rights groups and many people state, including the State Department, I believe. Do you agree with that?
I have no knowledge of it, but no direct personal knowledge of it, but no reason to disagree with those statements.
Do you agree with the AFL-CIO of this country and human rights groups all over the world that in Indonesia, internationally recognized worker rights do not exist?
I certainly recognize the inadequacy of adherence to core labor principles in Indonesia.
But as you're aware, that many groups throughout the world use the expression, there is a body of law called international recognized worker rights. Many groups throughout the world say they do not exist in Indonesia. What do you think? Do you accept that?
I accept that judgment.
Okay. Mr. Summers, are you aware of an amendment passed in 1994 by Congressman Frank and myself, which is very clear? And let me read that amendment for you, in case you don't remember it. It says, "The Secretary of the Treasury shall direct the United States executive directors of the international financial institutions to use the voice and vote of the United States to urge the respective institution to adopt policies to encourage borrowing countries to guarantee," that's the wording, "guarantee internationally recognized worker rights of the Trade Act of 1974. Are you aware of that amendment?
I am aware of that. I am aware of that amendment, yes.
Are you aware, Mr. Summers, that there is nothing in the proposal offered by the Indonesian government which, as the law requires, quote, guarantees internationally recognized worker rights?
Congressman, with respect, I would suggest to you that we have been in full compliance with the amendment. The Secretary of the Treasury has directed U.S. executive directors to use their voice and vote to urge adherence to labor rights. And in fact, executive directors have used their voice and vote to urge that the international financial institutions take those steps. Among the results of that effort have been a set of consultations historically unknown between the International Labor Organization and international financial institution officials and government officials in a number of key countries, including Indonesia. In the context of the country assistance strategy discussion for Indonesia, the U.S. Executive Director at the World Bank, in discussing development efforts, raised extensively a set of issues relating to labor rights.
So I don't mean to interrupt you. There's not a whole lot of time, but let me get back to this point. What the amendment says, to use the voice and vote. Vote.
That's correct.
Did our representative vote against this bailout?
Our representative voted in favor of the IMF program.
Okay.
That is,
despite,
I am advised by counsel, entirely consistent with the amendment, which requires that the voice and vote be used to urge policies in these institutions to take greater account of labor rights.
As the author of the amendment, I would respectfully disagree with your interpretation. I do know something about the amendment, and I do not understand how you can say that you have acted faithfully on behalf of the amendment when there's not one word in the agreement which guarantees internationally recognized worker rights. And I will pursue this issue. I think we may disagree up here. You know, we have all different political philosophies, but I hope that we can agree that when law is passed, that an administration, whether it's a Democratic administration or Republican administration, actually follows the law, or else we're wasting a lot of our time. And my last question.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, we have a large group and I'm particularly apologetic, but I want to give the benefit of the doubt to members that didn't make opening statements. I think it's only fair to the panel. In addition, Chairman Greenspan has to leave at 1 o'clock, and I think it's fair to move on. Mr. Bacchus.
Thank you. Chairman Greenspan, we all know that the Federal Reserve looks closely at inflationary pressures when they set monetary policy. To what extent have the recent developments in Asia affected U.S. inflationary pressures?
Well, as I commented to the Joint Economic Committee a couple of weeks ago, it's clearly reduced them in the sense that the growth rates are significantly slowing in those areas, and the international trading system is such that when growth slows in any part of that system, it works its way through the total system, so that it's very difficult to know exactly what specific estimates one uses, but clearly the sign is unambiguous, namely that it's reduced some of the pressures.
Right. Has that had an impact on Federal Reserve decision-making?
As I've said before this committee on numerous occasions, Congressman, we review a wide variety of factors in making judgments as to how our policy comes out at the end of our meetings. Certainly this is one of the factors which is involved in an evaluation of what's happening in this country, among others.
You said you consider various factors. When you're setting interest rates, you held them firm yesterday, you consider inflationary pressures. Do you also consider the effect of your decision-making on international markets?
We do, to the extent that it affects the United States. We are a very major part of the international trading system, obviously. It's very much to our advantage that that system function in an effective manner, fostering economic growth around the world. And therefore, we obviously take that into consideration, as we must.
Well, I would agree. We've talked about the growth shocks that we've had from East Asia and also the currency devaluations. There are some concerns that that could lead to global deflation. Do you share those concerns?
whenever you're dealing with the type of crises that we have seen periodically over the years, one must be prepared at all times for what can happen. In other words, you just do not make a judgment and then freeze it. What you do, especially in a dynamic, changing situation such as we've been through in Southeast Asia, is we reevaluate every day. In a sense, we monitor the markets as closely as we can. We try to understand as best we can the conceptual framework, if I may put it that way, that explains how the forces are evolving. And we change that periodically as events alter it. So we focus on this in some considerable detail.
Chairman, could we already make the judgment that, and I think you said unequivocally, that the developments are going to be disinflationary for the industrial nation?
No, I'm saying that the forces that have emerged out of the Southeast Asian difficulties are imparting a disinflationary effect on the United States and others. I'm not saying that they are dominant or overwhelming. Indeed, as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, they are a force, but they are not, at this stage, having severe dominant force on this country.
Would you characterize the East Asia economic instability as a significant threat to the world economy or to the international finance system?
No, I wouldn't. I would say it's something which is cause for concern. It's one which has got contagion effects associated with it, but I would...
Why, let me ask you this, why not? Would if we had a trade conflicts and you had escalating trade conflicts, would that then added to this be a significant threat?
I think we're falling far short of anything of where we have really serious threats. I think it's certainly of an order of magnitude that requires our attention, and I think the reason it requires our attention is that we don't wish it to become something which is a far more serious threat to the system.
All right. And my last question, you mentioned that this would have an effect on exports from Japan and therefore affect them. Do you consider it a threat to their, or a real influence on their banking system? Could it undermine their banking system?
Well, to the extent that the Japanese trade will be and has been and is being affected by the problems in Southeast Asia, it clearly affects all parts of the Japanese system. They are acutely aware of all of those problems, and that's from my conversations with the various officials in the Japanese government and in the central bank, they are very assiduously endeavoring to address them.
Thank you.
Mrs. Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the Dow Jones wire that just came out today, it says Chase Manhattan, the nation's largest bank, had a pre-tax trading revenue loss of $160 million in October because of what it termed, quote, unusually volatile and adverse trading markets, end quote. And it goes on to talk about their problems and the problems that, according to this, were touched off by the worldwide equity sell-off in Southeast Asia. And if we don't stabilize the markets, Mr. Greenspan, do you expect that other banks, other major banks and small banks will be suffering the same type of problems that Chase Manhattan is reporting today?
Well, I would scarcely argue that that is an amount of money which we would find de minimis, but it is not a large number in the sense that over the years, having observed what are the pluses and minuses to bank earnings, that is not a particularly awesome number, if I may put it that way. The aggregate size of their earnings is quite substantial. The losses that are involved in those trades in no way threaten in any means whatever the financial status of that institution. And I would surely expect that before this crisis, and I think it's a crisis because it's got certain types of contagions associated with it, before it is over, there will be lots of other losses recognized, but they are nowhere near the orders of magnitude which threaten the financial system of the United States, nor any of the major banking institutions in the developed world.
If we delay stabilizing the markets with support to the International Monetary Fund, which Secretary Rubin has supported, if we delay moving forward in that direction, would you expect, even given the strong economy of the United States, that there might be other small losses, like $160 million worth, to other institutions in our economy?
Well, one of the reasons why we at the Federal Reserve and certainly at the Treasury are advocating that we move forward in endeavoring to contain the contagion is precisely we're trying to fend off problems of that dimension, becoming more general, especially for smaller institutions. $160 million for a small institution is really a pretty big hit. There are, I would say to you that at the moment, we don't have serious contemplated financial problems in any of our institutions. If you asked me to hypothesize what types of events could happen, I could find scenarios which would get our attention pretty rapidly, but I see no evidence to suggest we're anywhere near close to that, and I should certainly hope that the endeavors that Treasury is moving forward on, and which we have been fully consulted about, will be more than sufficient to stem the contagion and the instabilities that we've observed.
Well, I certainly support Treasury's efforts, and according to the Dow, this, even though it's, as you said, a small ripple, they certainly feel that it will hurt the company's goal of annual growth and operation. One problem that we confront today in Congress is that it is my understanding that the Republican leadership will put on the floor a bill today which links the International Monetary Fund and the funding of that with the UN AREAs, the State Department reorganization, and family planning. And if IMF is attached to these contentious issues, then it increases it makes it more problematic, to say the least, to secure the needed funding for the International Monetary Fund. And do you think that this will undermine the credibility of U.S. efforts to cooperate with the International Monetary Fund and other countries to stabilize the Asian markets if for some reason we are not able to secure the funding due to the fact that it is tied to so many other issues for which there is a great deal of debate and lack of support in Congress?
Well, I can't get into the politics of it. All I can say is it would be to the interests of the United States to be able to go forward with that funding.
Okay, my time is up.
Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if
Excuse me, Mr. Greenspan has informed us that he should leave at 1. And you're welcome to, sir. It's your discretion.
Well, thank you. I give my proxy to Secretary Summers, but have the right to edit.
my announcement about forthcoming interest rates will be will impend.
I was about to say that I nonetheless reserve the right to edit his copy.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Summer, we've had quite a bit of discussion here today about one of the more popular buzz phrases of recent times with the popular media, and that being deflation. And I know that with the recent financial turmoil in Asia, that it has given a lot more emphasis to that question and that concern. But I guess my question to you along the line is, remembering my basic college definitions of not disinflation but deflation, doesn't that require a general currency appreciation or at least a fall in the general price levels? With that in mind, and enlighten me please, do you really see any signs of that kind of thing, whether it be in Asia or around the world, a general decline in price levels or a general currency appreciation, as opposed to perhaps values of particular commodities, be they land or other things, that perhaps have taken some realigning moves in recent months or days?
I do not see at this point any signs of a generalized decline in prices, certainly not in the United States or in other major countries. I think we are seeing disinflationary pressures of a quite profound kind, reflecting increased competition, increases in productivity, reflecting the impact on export prices of some of the developments that we've seen in Asia. But at this point, I would describe the pressures on the United States as being of a disinflationary sort, and certainly not as representing a deflation.
And certainly being disinflationary, that's not an ominous sign. That is in many ways, if it helps to promote general stability price-wise, potentially a positive thing, as long as it stays on this side of the line and does not become deflation.
Certainly we in the administration have respected the independence of the Federal Reserve precisely because we recognize the importance of the goal of price stability.
And another comment along those lines, which might have been better directed to the chairman, but my learned colleague made the comments earlier about the price of gold and the general decline of the last so many months, year or so, to the levels we had reached now. By tradition, gold has always been not only a store of value, but a hedge against uncertainty. Is it fair for me to assume that as long as we have stable gold prices or a gentle decline in the gold prices, that reflects confidence by those individuals out there in the financial markets, in the economies, that they would not pursue gold in such a fashion as to push the price up? Am I reading too much into that?
I think it is a relevant I think the price of gold would generally be felt to be a relevant indicator both of inflation psychology and of the degree of uncertainty. But I think many, many factors go into the price of gold at any point in time, including sales of gold by official institutions, including the demand for gold and jewelry and all of that, that I think one would have to acknowledge, despite the fact that the price of gold has declined, that with events in financial markets in the last several months, there has been some generalized increase in financial market uncertainty, and I think that's reflected in the increased volatility of many prices. It's reflected in the ways in which various kinds of options are priced. So I think it is a relevant indicator, but I would have to say that the degree of uncertainty is higher now than it has been at many points in the past.
And would you agree with the assertion made in the earlier testimony today that as long as, to my paraphrase, as long as short-term resources chase long-term obligations, that we will always have the potential for these periods of realignment?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas, and I see you've given back a few seconds, and that's appreciated. Mr. Hinchey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Summers, the BLS just this morning reported that productivity growth for the recent quarter, the third quarter, is up by 4.5%. That means that we've had 4 quarters of steady growth now in productivity. My question is, what policies ought we be pursuing in order to try to ensure that the benefits of this growth in productivity can be shared more equitably among American citizens?
I think the single most important thing we can do in that regard is to make our education system work more effectively. And that's been a centerpiece of what we in the administration have been trying to do over the last several years, both to increase the quantity, if you like, of education by making community colleges available through the Hope credit, and college increasingly affordable through the tuition deduction.
May I interrupt you? Please excuse me, but I've only got 5 minutes, and I know that that's a good answer, and it's one that I support, and I know that it's one that the administration is pursuing, and I fully endorse it and want to do everything I can as a member of Congress to help that. But but that's more of a long-term prospect. I'm concerned with the fact that we haven't had any increase in the standard of living of American workers now for more than 2 decades, except that since the Clinton administration has been in, we've had some marginal increase. But it's been stagnant or declining for the 20 years prior to that, out of this last 25. What policies ought we be pursuing immediately? Monetary, fiscal policies immediately to try to spread the benefits more equitably.
I think because of the success of the policies we've pursued, particularly of deficit reduction over the last 5 years, we're enjoying the first investment and export-led recovery that this country has enjoyed since the early 1960s. And the rate of investment in our country as a share of income is, particularly for equipment investment, is higher than it's been since statistics began to be computed. That means more tools for workers, which means more productivity and means rising standards of living. So I think we have to maintain the kind of policy approach that we have been pursuing now that a balanced budget is in sight, and that offers us the prospect for the kind of inclusive prosperity that I think we all seek. That, along with the longer-term public investments in education, in something that we in Treasury have been particularly focused on, ensuring the, if you like, democratizing the access to capital by making sure that capital is available in our inner cities, in some of the poorer parts of our country, to create jobs, I think offers us the best prospect for making sure that these benefits are as fully shared as they possibly can be.
Would you agree with the remark that was made at the August Federal Open Market Committee that real interest rates are too high? Short-term interest rates?
I would be reluctant to comment on the appropriate level of interest rates. I would say that a traditional problem we've had in our country is too low a rate of national saving, and that means there's less capital supplied, which leads interest rates to be higher than they otherwise would be. And I think that one of the fortunate features of the economic policies we've pursued in recent years is that by bringing down budget deficits, they've operated to increase national saving and take some of the pressure off credit markets. $1 trillion that otherwise would have gone into the sterile asset of government bonds is now available for private investment.
Isn't it time we did something about the exchange rate with Japan? And in the context of this apparent deflation in the Asian markets and the overproduction that is seemingly replete throughout the industrial world.
As I'm sure you can appreciate, I'm reluctant to comment on exchange rates beyond observing that our policy continues to be what it has been, as articulated by Secretary Rubin and by the G7 in Hong Kong.
Well, if I may be so bold as to suggest that it may be time for the Treasury to pay some attention to that exchange rate, and it may be time for us to begin to deal with the problem of the trade deficit. which is only going to be exacerbated now as a result of what we've seen in the Asian markets. Our trade deficit is going to increase. I think that that's a sound prediction, and most other people are making it as a result of what's happening over there. And I think that now is the time to address that exchange rate problem as a way to attempt to mitigate the possibly dramatic increases that are going to occur in the trade deficit.
Mr. Hinchey, I apologize. Your time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Metcalf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just would like to I'll try to be really brief, but could you briefly explain what new arrangements are embodied in the new arrangements to borrow? If you've already covered this, I was out for a while, I'll apologize, but what is the new arrangements to borrow embody?
New arrangement to borrow is in effect a credit line that the IMF can make, that the United States can make available, and the United States along with other countries can make available to the IMF to supplement its liquidity in the event that it needs extra liquidity in order to be able to respond to a financial crisis. The resources under the new arrangement to borrow are then secured by the IMF's guarantee, backed by the IMF's reserves, including a substantial volume of gold.
Okay. In a recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, former Secretary of the Treasury William Simon recently suggested that the IMF be abolished, arguing that the fund has been ineffective in preventing currency crises and in promoting international monetary stability. Is that criticism fair?
Respectfully, I would strongly disagree with former Secretary Simon. There is to be sure more currency instability than any of us would like to see. But I believe that the IMF and the actions that it has been able to take has served Americans well. It has served Americans well by maintaining stability in situations where there otherwise could have been very substantial instability, with threats to the financial system and with threats to American security interests. I think of examples like the IMF's participation following the debt crisis in 1982 in Latin America, which had very serious potential consequences for the entire American financial system. I think of the IMF's role in what I think has been a successful effort to bring Russia, which was 5 years ago on the brink of hyperinflation, towards a more effective private sector economy. And I think of the IMF's role in making sure that the burden of responding to problems of this kind is internationally shared, as it has in the program that it has provided for Indonesia. So I believe that both on grounds of burden sharing and on grounds of our major national interest in stability around the world, and on grounds of our direct commercial interest in avoiding devaluations and currency instability that would put American workers at an unfair disadvantage, we have a very strong interest in maintaining the IMF as a strong institution.
Does the I haven't looked, and this is my fault, but how much, does it guarantee loans and then generally doesn't have to pay or doesn't have to lose money? Does it lose money? How much money does it take each year for the IMF? Any rough guess? I wouldn't hold you to it, but just...
The IMF has not cost American taxpayers 1 penny in the 50 years of its existence. It makes loans which, with a very small number of quite minor exceptions, have been repaid in full, and the exceptions are more than fully reserved against.
So we don't have any appropriations to the IMF every year?
We do not have an annual appropriation for the IMF. We make a quota allocation to the IMF, which scores at 0 under our budget system, because it is treated in effect as a risk-free loan.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that that doesn't cost us money, but thank you.
Just for precision, Congressman, I should say that the IMF maintains a small concessional program for some of the world's poorest countries, the ESAF, and since that program is concessional, it does involve a cost. The appropriation we have sought each year for that is in the range of $7 to $10 million each year.
Okay. I have a very brief question on the U.S. is going to backstop the IMF perhaps with money from the Economic Exchange Stabilization Fund. What are limitations on the use of the Exchange Stabilization Fund?
The statute from 1933 setting up the Exchange Stabilization Fund grants the Secretary of the Treasury authority to use it with the approval of the President, gives the Secretary broad authority to provide loans and credits to foreign countries, provided that such actions are consistent with U.S. obligations in the IMF to provide a stable system, of exchange rates. The ESF was established in 1934 with a $2 billion appropriation, and it now has total assets of $37 billion, of which $30 billion are available in the form of dollars and foreign currencies. And the statute authorizes the Secretary to provide loans and credits for the purpose of maintaining orderly exchange arrangements and a stable system of exchange rates. Historically, it's been used many times in the past to enter into swap arrangements, to finance exchange market intervention, and on occasion to provide guarantees.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Metcalf. Mr. Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Summers, and just for a point of reference, and this is not my question, but has the United States, hasn't the United States actually used some of its drawing rights under the IMF, under its agreements with the IMF in the past? In the early 80s, I think, or
in 1978, at a time of substantial currency instability and the value of the dollar, the United States withdrew a portion, as countries are allowed to do when they have a problem, withdrew a portion of its quota contribution.
So in fact, we've utilized
to the IMF. So we have utilized the IMF in that sense.
I had a number of questions, and I hope to get through them. I've been waiting for a few hours, as you have. First of all, I supported the administration on the pace of devaluation situation. I think that was the right thing to do. The ESF now has more money in it, I think, as a result of that, and we were lucky. But I think it was important because of Mexico's trading position with the United States and the border we share, and among other things. Probably I will support, if it comes to us, something to do with the Asian situation. But we talked a little bit about the '82 debt crisis. We've talked about parallels with the S&L crisis. We haven't talked as much about the high yield or junk bond market and some parallels that exist. And then of course we have Mexico. And it seems we have this recurring trend of sort of hot money or fast money chasing higher yields, and those markets do correct themselves. The junk bond market today is actually pretty good. What's left of the S&L industry is in pretty good shape. The debt crisis seems to have been worked out, but the problem keeps coming back to these crises that occur. And you talk about transparency and the need for developing structures in lesser developed countries. Your testimony, you list the fact that we've gone from 16 countries in '92 that could issue sovereign debt in the open markets to 56, I think, currently. And I guess the one question I've got, and it makes it harder for myself, and I know it's hard for a number of my members on my side, is the source of external capital is not coming necessarily from individual investors. It's coming through mutual funds and pension funds and things like that, but it's being directed by people who are big boys or sophisticated investors. And at some point, they have to bear responsibility. And I know you've addressed that, Chairman Greenspan addressed that. and I realize we have to be concerned about the systemic effect of even a 12% part of our trading economy, but again, at some point we have to look back and say, aren't your analysts, aren't you guys looking a little more closely at what you're investing in and where you're putting your capital? Certainly you would think that they would. And you know, we can't write the disclosure rules for the rest of the world. We can certainly make requests and we can have international standards, but ultimately they're going to have to decide. But there does have to be some responsibility borne by the investors themselves. And you don't need to comment on it necessarily. I mean, I realize if you want to, that's fine. But I did want to raise that point. I also, if I could, wanted to ask, and this was touched on in part by Chairman Greenspan. From what I read with respect to Japan, Japanese banks have almost $38 billion of loans in the Asian countries, the increasing non-performing status. In today's Wall Street Journal, there's in one of the market articles, they're talking about an increasing premium that Japanese banks are paying for capital, 20 to 25 basis points over what the market rate would otherwise be. Chairman Greenspan sort of touched on this, but I don't think addressed it, probably didn't want to. But do you see a concern with the Japanese banking system down the road? We've had hearings in the past, and it's of course their problem with their internal recessionary situation, but now it's external. Is that a crisis waiting to happen?
Let me first say that I share the Chairman's judgment that there is nothing that has happened to date or that is in prospect that represents a threat to the integrity of or robustness of the U.S. financial system. I think the Japanese authorities have recognized that Japan faces serious financial problems, have recognized the need to work through those financial problems by disposing of bad assets off bank balance sheets and the like, and that what is critical is that they now carry through with effective policies on the commitments that they have made. I think that for them to do so is very much in Japan's interest and is more generally in the global interest.
With the Chairman's indulgence, very quickly, if Congress
briefly,
does
though,
not,
we have two more witnesses, but go ahead.
Right. If the Congress does not appropriate the funds that were stripped out of the Foreign Operations Bill, can you go forward with the plan, or can the IMF go forward with the plan dealing with the Asian economic situation?
The Indonesian program can go ahead, but I believe we will have diminished our own capacity to respond to what the unpredictable future may bring in a way that is detrimental to our national interest, our national economic interests.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had two questions. One was for Mr. Greenspan, dealing with the value of the dollar, which I will ask you since you've been lucky enough to stay. And also had a question on the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which I think you partially answered. I don't know whether it's to my entire satisfaction, but I do want to bring that up once again. I see the responsibility of us here in the Congress to protect the dollar. I do not see where we should assume that our responsibility here, or the American taxpayer, is to protect the value of foreign currencies. So that is where I start. Now, Mr. Greenspan in his testimony mentioned that it was significant factors contributing to the problem in the Far East had to do with real exchange rates and also unsustainable current account deficits. And yet we run a high accounts deficit, highest in the world, and we have the largest foreign debt. So I would say that this should concern us about the future of the dollar. Although the dollar is riding high, we have high real interest rates. And this may well tell us something about the dollar as well as the price of gold. So the bond market gives us some information there. And those who are concerned about the deflation might just look at the monetary figures showing that M3 right now is currently rising at greater than 10%. So I don't think that we're on the verge of a rapid deflation here anyway. I would like to suggest, though, that to say that the IMF costs us no money is just a little bit disingenuous. We put probably $50 billion in over the year, and we can't use it for anything else. We can't take it out of there and send it to our Social Security beneficiaries. So just because we don't count it in our deficit isn't quite fair. I mean, that to me is just a gimmick. It's sort of like us borrowing from the trust funds and borrowing from Social Security and not counting it in the deficit. But our obligations keep going up. Our national debt keeps going up. We have an obligation now of $17 trillion, which to me is all pressure on the dollar. And every time we go in to bail out these other currencies, I see this as putting tremendous pressure on the dollar. And I want to get your opinion about, do you have any concern about the dollar? Shouldn't we be cautious when we do these things? And also on the Exchange Stabilization Fund, you indicate that there is some technical explanation on the Exchange Stabilization Fund to allow you to do what you're doing. But is it not true that this fund was never used to bail out foreign currencies before? Basically, it was set up to protect the dollar. And here we are, we did it in Mexico, and now we're doing it again. And if you come up short, I'm sure there's plans to borrow more from the Federal Reserve, because if the IMF funding doesn't go through, you're not going to have enough money, and you're going to need to go over to the Federal Reserve and get the credit from the Federal Reserve. So I think I can't be convinced that the Exchange Stabilization Fund is really set up to do this. And I am indeed concerned about the future of the dollar. Just a few years ago, we got 80 yen to the dollar. So the markets can turn down, the economy can turn down, revenues can go down, and there's no reason in the world for us not to expect some real burdens here. And my obligation under my oath of office is to protect the American taxpayer and to protect the dollar, not to be carelessly bailing out everybody and our investors overseas.
Congressman, let me first just emphasize something I tried to emphasize in my original oral statement, that the actions we have taken and will take are based on our judgment of how best to pursue American interests and are not motivated by any goal of charity or comity with respect to other countries. On the question of the Exchange Stabilization Fund, I've just been handed legislative language in which Senator Helms explained that the purpose of this amendment, referring to an amendment in 1977, is to specify that the purpose of the exchange stabilization is not exclusively to stabilize the exchange value of the dollar. And indeed, as part of maintaining financial stability, loans to other countries or guarantees to other countries have been provided on many, many occasions in the past, going back at least into the 1960s. That is not a recent practice. We believe that as Americans concerned with the stability of our own economy and our own financial system, we have to recognize that that stability can be put at risk by developments abroad. And that is appropriate, therefore, as a kind of forward defense of preserving our stability, for us to be supportive of efforts to maintain financial stability in other countries. And that is what we've done through our contribution and our support for efforts at the IMF. The question of the cost of those efforts, perhaps the distinctions are a bit academic. What we have incurred in return for the contribution to the IMF is that we hold an asset represented by our share in the IMF and its financial proceeds. And it is a question of what the value of that asset is, but in light of the historical experience, which is that the financial support the IMF has provided has almost invariably been repaid in full and on time with interest. And in light of the substantial gold reserves that are held by the IMF, I do not feel that we have in any way put taxpayers' funds imprudently at risk with our support for the IMF.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Dr. Weld.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you, Mr. Summers. I think this has been a very important hearing so far. As I understand it, the U.S. stock market is up a little bit today, or it's holding its own, but as we all know, it went down about another 2% yesterday. You alluded to, in your comments, the importance of the $3.5 billion of additional funding to the IMF, and certainly that's something I'm very interested in. In the House here, that's gotten tied up, as Mrs. Maloney alluded to, with the so-called Mexico City policy, the policy established by Ronald Reagan back in 1984 that said no U.S. taxpayer dollars can go to organizations that perform abortions or that lobby foreign governments to overturn their pro-life laws. And the House, and that's very similar to the so-called Hyde language, which is supported by most Americans and most members of the House and Senate, to not use U.S. taxpayer dollars for abortions in the United States. The House had an overturn of the Mexico City, or reinstating the Mexico City policy, despite the President's claim that he wanted to keep abortion rare but legal. The first thing he did after he got elected was he overturned that Reagan policy. The House reinstated that policy, and the President has been opposing that. And what I'm very curious about, maybe you can answer this question for me, in an attempt to try to get us through the process here, the House negotiators said to the President, you can have your money to go to these international organizations that perform abortions, but in an effort to compromise, we don't want any money to go to organizations that are lobbying to overturn pro-life laws in all these foreign countries. And the President said no, or at least his staff said no. And as a consequence, we're at the impasse we're at. And for me as a legislator, the question I have for you is, how serious is the administration about this $3.5 billion to the IMF if they are willing to literally allow it to be held hostage like this over something like lobbying foreign countries for abortion? It would seem to me, at least from my perspective, that the White House is not very serious, that it considers spreading abortion on a global basis more important than stabilizing these currencies and stabilizing these markets.
Congressman Weldon, I know that the Mexico City issue is one on which there are very strong feelings on both sides, although I'm not personally involved with the details of that issue. What I think I can say is that from the point of view of what I think is an important national interest, maintaining economic stability in our country, that it would be best that these issues not be linked, and that a judgment be reached on the merits of providing support through the NAB, which I think is very much in our national interest, and that we reach that judgment, and then that the political process reconcile different views in whatever way is best with respect to the set of issues around Mexico City. But I do not see the advantage, and I see some real risk in terms of the objective of promoting financial stability to the linkage of the two issues.
Well, certainly, well, let me say this, everything is linked. You know, we have in this legislation the funding for example, Israel is in the Foreign Operations Bill.
And in there is the money to go to family planning. And certainly I'm not opposed to family planning. I certainly supported it as it was implemented by the Reagan administration, where they were not taking U.S. taxpayer dollars and using it to perform abortions overseas and to lobby foreign governments to overturn their laws. I think we have a real international crisis here, and I'm quoting Alan Greenspan when I use that word. I was surprised to hear him say that. But yet the President is allowing this to be, you know, involved like this, and I think it's a mistake on his part. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman? Can I do a quick follow-up? I know you have another.
Yes, Mr. Benson, but I hope not at great length, but you're welcome to do a follow-up.
Very brief. Secretary Summers, with all due respect to my colleague, who's holding the hostage here? Is it the administration, or is it the leadership of the House that has tied family planning with the IMF funding?
Well, I believe the administration is happy to see each of these issues considered on its own merits. I would just want to stress that the IMF does not have any connection of any kind, to my knowledge, to any issues associated with family planning or abortion, and so it seemed to me to be appropriate to make a judgment about whether, as I and Chairman Greenspan very strongly believe, the NAB is very much in our national economic interest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Secretary Summers, and I would just like to conclude with the observation that the administration has certain discretion in terms of issues like the IMF, but that discretion from the Congress is implicitly one that involves consultation, and I hope that the Treasury understands that, and that close consultation with our leadership in this committee would be appreciated.
We look forward to exactly that kind of close consultation, and let me thank you once again for providing me with the opportunity to present the Department's views on these important issues.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I would like to ask the next panel if they could come forward. The second panel is composed of Mr. John Lipsky. Mr. Lipsky is the Chase Manhattan Bank's chief economist, and previously he was chief economist at Solomon Brothers. Robert D. Hormats, who is vice chairman of Goldman Sachs, and he priorly served as senior deputy assistant secretary for economic and business affairs at the Department of State. Our third witness is Dr. C. Fred Berkston, who is director of the Institute for International Economics. Our fourth witness is Dr. David D. Hale, who is a global chief economist for the Zurich Insurance Group and its investment affiliates. Our final witness is Mr. Jerome I. Levinson. Mr. Levinson is currently professor at American University Washington College of Law. He's also research associate for the Economic Policy Institute and has served as counsel to Arnold and Porter. We will begin with Dr. Lipsky.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I'm John Lipsky, Chief Economist and Director of Research at the Chase Manhattan Bank. I'm honored by the invitation to appear today to discuss the recent foreign exchange and financial market instability in Asia. I have submitted a written statement, and I would welcome the opportunity to summarize it briefly. The principal points I'd like to make first: global growth prospects will be diminished next year as a result of the financial crisis in Asia. With regards to the United States, Chase Research anticipates that the expansion will slow to, the U.S. expansion will slow to a below-trend pace of 1% to 1.5% lower by 0.5% or 1%, lower than we had expected prior to the Asian currency crisis. Secondly, inflation risk will recede. U.S. consumer price inflation will remain within the current range of 2 to 2.5% next year. By 1999, however, the dollar's strengthening versus Asian currencies should help to drive U.S. inflation noticeably lower. Thus, if I might remark, the Goldilocks phase of the U.S. expansion is drawing to a close, in that the recent remarkable combination of solid growth, high rates of capacity utilization, and low inflation likely will be superseded over the course of the coming year by a more conventional combination of sluggish growth, modestly rising unemployment, and stable or falling inflation. If Chase Research's U.S. growth forecast is on target, therefore, the Federal Reserve's federal funds rate could be reduced by between 50 to 100 basis points over the coming year as an appropriate aid to an eventual return to trend growth. Additional reductions in long-term Treasury bond yields also would be likely, extending the recent rally. Now, for financial markets, this combination of factors points to a repricing of risk, reflecting the significantly heightened uncertainties about the outlook and an expected reduction in average credit quality. Of course, this follows several years in which improving credit quality helped reduce the risk premia charged to borrowers to record low levels. Even if the recent widening of credit spreads proves to have been overdone, therefore, a return to recent lows would be unlikely. Of course, the international financial situation has not yet been stabilized, and market pressures remain intense. New Asian currency declines would further undermine economic prospects in the region and elsewhere, reducing asset values and continuing the disquieting process of competitive devaluation. In this sense, the current situation contains potential systemic threats. The highly successful efforts of the past 50 years to create an open, multilateral, non-discriminatory market in international trade and payments cannot be taken for granted. Now, the roots of the current crisis are complex and multifaceted. I discussed that topic at some length in my prepared statement. The problems range far beyond simple choices of exchange rate policies. There can be little doubt, however, that the recent set of decisions to depreciate currencies in the ASEAN area in Southeast Asia, beginning with the Thai baht in mid-July, was handled in a fashion that exacerbated the problems. It was as if a group decision was made to jump into deep water without anyone checking to see if they knew how to swim first. Essentially, this is the first widespread crisis of confidence to occur in the 1990s world of securitized global finance. That is, today, long-term cross-border capital flows are dominated by direct investment and securities purchases rather than by bank loans. Restoring financial and economic stability inevitably will involve efforts by both the individual countries involved as well as by the international community, led by the International Monetary Fund. Inescapably, monetary and fiscal policies will have to be tightened and structural reforms accelerated in countries whose currencies have been weakening. While financial support from the international community for reform efforts may be helpful in some cases, the principal challenge today is restoring policy credibility and investor confidence rather than increasing liquidity. These problems will not be solved simply by throwing money in their way. To extend the U.S. disinflation trend that has been in evidence for more than a year. Fears of outright deflation, however, are exaggerated. Finally, there's an interest rate risk channel. Investors' reassessments of risks in emerging markets and elsewhere has led to a sharp widening of yield spreads that will raise the cost of financing business investment and consumption. Now, consumer spending here in the U.S. will also be muted by the stock market's recent decline. and frankly, the potential exists for additional stock market setbacks in response to slowing growth. Plausible estimates of the wealth effect imply that a 10% stock market correction would reduce GDP growth by about a half a percentage point over the course of the following year. Now, it also seems likely that falling long-term interest rates will do little to cushion the economy in the near term. Declining Treasury bond yields reflect a flight to quality that has been associated with a widening of risk spreads. Indeed, the fall in Treasury yields in recent weeks has offered little relief to investment-grade borrowers, while the cost of financing for non-investment-grade borrowers has risen. Today, the risks, the dampening influence of the Asian crisis is already evident beyond the United States as well. In particular, heightened uncertainty about the economic and financial environment has altered the Latin American outlook, as I think has become widely recognized in the wake of the serious policy tightening that has been undertaken in Brazil. Even in the best case scenario, 1998 Latin American growth will slow significantly. But perhaps more notable, so far European leaders have suggested that the events in Asia will have only a limited impact on their economies. Yet Asian trade is as important for Europe as a bloc as it is for the United States. It accounts for about 1/3 of their total external trade. Moreover, the spillover of the Asian crisis to emerging markets in Europe, most especially Russia, indicates that the impact on industrial economies in the region will be felt sooner rather than later. In any case, with growth set to slow next year in all of the major non-European countries, it is not realistic to expect that European economies will avoid the effect. The risk, therefore, is that the negative impact on European growth of developments in Asia and Eastern Europe, as well as in the Americas, will turn out to be similar in scope, if not greater, than that for the United States. If so, Europe's expansion could sink to a below-trend pace, and the already high unemployment rates there could rise further. Even though the Asian currency crisis is still unfolding, it is not too early to consider carefully the causes of the turmoil so that appropriate remedies can be adopted. As I mentioned earlier, the problems evident today in Asia have deep roots, and they're both domestic and international. 3 of these are particularly notable. 1, Japan's unresolved structural problems and troubled financial sector. 2, opaque and inefficient domestic financial systems in many Asian countries. And 3, the rapid opening of China to foreign trade and investment, which was accelerated by their sharp 1994 currency depreciation. I explore the causes more fully in my statement, but in the interest of brevity, I'll turn now instead to measures that we think might be appropriate to halt the crisis. In order to stop the financial instability and restore confidence before even greater damage is done to global growth prospects, or more importantly, to the international trade and payment system, both domestic and international actions will be required. With regard to domestic initiatives, it has become clear that Asian monetary policies will have to be tightened in order to stabilize the region's currencies and calm fears of a new round of competitive depreciation. Until now, even those Asian countries that hiked rates when their currencies came under pressure have been anxious to ease monetary conditions as soon as possible in order to stimulate domestic activity. Protecting the banking system from losses has taken priority over restoring investor confidence, as if the two were mutually exclusive. Officials' attempts to shield their economies and financial sectors from market forces should be curtailed. Such actions, though politically appealing, have been counterproductive in the extreme. The lack of timely financial disclosure earlier had muted the potential for market discipline, while subsidized credits and other aids introduced substantial moral hazard. By now, events have gone so far that the credit quality even of sovereign borrowers, particularly Thailand and Korea, has been impaired. The international financial community, led by the IMF, must play a central role in halting this dangerous spiral, which seemingly has grown beyond the ability of individual countries to control. Whatever its limitations, the fund, as a proxy for the international community as a whole, establishes the guiding principles for international financial relations. Nonetheless, it must be recognized that we are faced with new challenges that require new thinking. In 1994 and 95, the Mexican peso crisis represented a new challenge that required an unprecedented infusion of official funds in order to stabilize the situation and restore confidence at that time. In contrast, the current situation represents a policy-induced crisis of confidence. In the current circumstances, the challenge for the fund is not one of providing additional liquidity. In fact, if a loss of confidence is the problem, no amount of IMF money is enough. On the other hand, if confidence can be restored quickly, official funds might not be required at all. So to deal with this crisis of confidence in a world of securitized finance, the IMF should consider alternative mechanisms for supporting policy reform and encouraging better macroeconomic cooperation at the regional level. Specifically, we would suggest 3 initiatives. First, the fund should reinstate its earlier practice of encouraging precautionary standby arrangements for countries that adopt appropriate policy measures but which do not exhibit a clear balance of payments financing need. Thus, countries could benefit from the fund's seal of approval without sending to investors a signal that there is a serious financing problem in the balance of payments. To a greater extent than in the past, such precautionary arrangements should be activated preemptively in order to forestall a renewed loss of confidence. And second, and a related point, is that the fund must recognize its unavoidable role in guiding investor perceptions about the appropriateness of policies in member countries. I am, of course, conscious of the importance of the fund's confidential dialogue with its members. Nevertheless, more can and should be done to encourage countries to be forthright about their economic and financial situation so that investment decisions are based on accurate perceptions of risk and reward. Third, the fund should encourage greater regional cooperation in macroeconomic management so that the current cycle of competitive devaluations can be avoided in the future. We learned in the 1930s just how destructive such practices can be. Indeed, setting clear and binding rules for international commercial relations was the principal motivation for the IMF's founding. The approach I am proposing differs significantly from the conventional wisdom about the Asian crisis. The common view is that the ASEAN countries are being victimized by the combination of poorly chosen exchange rate policies and runaway capital markets. So-called hot money is being withdrawn in a panic, so the story goes, suggesting that the appropriate remedy involves little more than new external credits in order to restore depleted liquidity, together with flexible exchange rates and perhaps new controls on short-term capital flows. The analysis I have offered today suggests that this is exactly the wrong approach. Greater, not less, reliance on market forces is needed. Transparent domestic capital markets are essential, not new controls. The choice of exchange rate regime is far less important than the application of coherent monetary and fiscal policies within a well-understood framework. Private cross-border capital flows are not the principal source of the regional instability that has afflicted Asia and spread beyond, and there is no practical possibility that official flows could provide a substitute source of capital. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lipsky. Let me say to the other panelists, we're in our last day of the session. This panel was set up when we thought Congress would be adjourned, and I'd be appreciative if people could bear some time constraints in mind. And, Dr. Hormats.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I will try to keep this brief and consistent with your thoughts on this. Let me just try to cover in a very summary way some of the key points in the written testimony. Let me make a point at the outset, and that is that the critical ingredient in managing these problems is, first of all, the internal actions of the countries themselves to improve their own circumstances and put their economies on a stable footing to achieve growth in the medium term. But another critical ingredient is American leadership in this process, and I think this is why this hearing is particularly important and why I commend you and your colleagues for this, because American leadership is the critical ingredient. The President's fond of saying that we're the indispensable country. We certainly are in terms of restoring market confidence and helping these countries to address their problems. And there are a variety of ways that this affects the world. First of all, in Asia. The position of the United States in Asia is beginning to be suspect in the minds of some Asians for a variety of reasons. There's a feeling the United States is looking inward more and that we're not playing as active a role in Asia politically, from a security point of view and from an economic point of view, as we should. And that is a major concern down the road, a major geopolitical concern, but it's also a major economic concern because Asia is an extremely important, as you pointed out, area for American trade and investment. The question of the NAB is very important here. It seems to me that for reasons that Larry Summers mentioned a little while ago, the NAB is critical both to the IMF in general in supporting other potential problems, but also demonstrating that the U.S. is still the leader of the global economy. The U.S. has been champion of open markets and a stable economy and a growing economy for the last 50 years. That is an important symbol of this, and particularly it's important to the American economy because so much of our growth depends on increased exports, and therefore we need a thriving global financial market to help with the overall improvement in our exports that we need, both to create jobs and because more and more Americans in their pension funds have stocks and bonds of American companies and foreign companies. And if we're talking about pension reform, pensions and the long-term well-being of America's workers, their jobs and their pension funds increasingly depend on an open global economy. I know the issue of fast track is a divisive one in the Congress, but I do think it's important to say that the failure of fast track creates in the minds of a lot of countries around the world the feeling that the United States is not playing as active and progressive a leadership role as it can. And Chairman Greenspan made the point a few moments ago that one of his concerns was that some countries would turn inward. My concern is that if they see the biggest economy in the world, the most prosperous economy in the world, the leader of open markets, what they perceive in their view to be moving back from commitment to a global economy, then the pressures in these countries to turn their backs on the global economy will grow. And I think John Lipsky's made an interesting point. The answer to these questions is more use of market forces, more openness to trade, more openness to financial services, and that's what we ought to be promoting. It's much harder for us to do if we don't have our own new trade legislation. And then I would simply make one other point, and that is the events in Iraq, if in fact the United States is required to take some action, will have an important effect on the stability of financial markets, and we're going to need to demonstrate that we're working with these other countries and other areas to maintain the sort of coalition support that is important in terms of global solidarity, if in fact it comes to that. The last point to start this out, and then I'll just cover everything else very briefly, is critical ingredient here is Japan, China, and the U.S. working together. They're the three major economies. China's playing a greater role in the region. Japan has an enormous stake in the region. And the U.S., for reasons that have been amply discussed before this committee over the last couple of hours, has a critical role to play. And the Chinese have been very constructive in this. The Japanese, for their own domestic reasons, have not been able to do as much at home and abroad as they should. And the United States has been seen by the region to be somewhat tentative in the case of Thailand and beginning to move back with respect to Indonesia. But there are a lot of question marks as to whether we're going to play the very positive role we should play. Let me just briefly go through a few highlight points of this testimony and then turn it over to my colleague. Financial turmoil in emerging economies of East Asia has caused volatility in U.S. markets rather than vice versa. The oil crisis of the 1970s and early 1980s demonstrated dramatically to Americans that the United States was part of an interdependent global economy. The recent East Asian turbulence has demonstrated